Well, good evening. I call the special meeting of the Ames City Council for Tuesday night, July 20th to order. This is a work session this evening, and we have one item on the one formal item on the agenda, and that's staff presentation and overview of the draft Ames 2040 plan. And just for public who may be watching, there'll be no public input this evening. This is primarily for staff to share with council the first draft, and then on August 3rd, we'll have another work session where we will be giving staff direction, and then they'll be released to the public. So I'll turn it over to Kelly.
All right. Well, thank you. Happy to be here tonight. So for tonight, we have a plan, as the mayor just said, to give you two opportunities to look through this document, because it's the first time you've ever had a complete draft of all of the components of Plan 2040. Tonight, we're really going to walk through the structure of the document. I have a couple of questions at the end. You can ask questions during the presentation if you want. We're talking about different elements and chapters of the plan. And I'm also going to highlight two things that you have not seen before in the land use and growth chapter that we would obviously want to get feedback from as we go through this as well. And as the mayor mentioned, August 3rd is the day where we really want to get final direction, decisions, edits, clarifications, anything along those lines. And if we can do that, and if hopefully if they're to a minimum, not to limit you, but hopefully we're close enough to the target that there's not a lot of edits that you're going to give us, then we can proceed to get a public draft available by the middle of August. That's our goal. If we can get it out by the middle of August, that would work very well for completing the outreach early in the fall and getting back through the actual approval process for the comprehensive plan. If on August 3rd it needs more work, there's things that aren't there, then we'll have to discuss what does that mean for a public review date. But that's what we're really hoping for. So we've been at this for quite some time. We're at just over 2 years in discussion of Plan 2040 from the time we really started doing work with the city council and taking the public input phase and trying to translate that into themes and topics and issues for the city council. So you've had 11 workshops that directly tied to content that would end up in this plan tonight. So This wasn't made up out of thin air over the last 9 months. It was taking that input that you had. Now, what is important tonight is we've fleshed it out. What you've seen are PowerPoints. You've seen 3 to 5 slides about a topic with bullets, short snippets from staff and from RDG about what we're trying to address. So with the full plan, now you get to see how it comes together, see if we're on the mark for what we were supposed to, how we're supposed to capture your thoughts. Make sure we have the right content in here. So very quickly, kind of in the background, for those that may not have been following along for a while here, let me give you a very short summary of how we got to today. When we started this was a plan to look at 20 years out, and what does that mean? We're really going to be planning for about 15,000 new persons in the city. We went through an exercise, RDG went through an exercise on projections, talking about different kinds of growth rates. How do you isolate or account for student population with what we're calling permanent population? And when we went through this with you, we landed on planning for 1.5% growth rate. It's a very healthy growth rate. It was the rate that was similar to the prior 10 years before other things came into play here the last couple of years. And that was about 15,000 people. So we're really talking about a population of 80,000 as maybe a target population for service levels for 2040. And we needed to have some idea of the number of people to then guide the land use choices that go along with that. It's one thing just to talk about projections on people, but where are they going to be? What kind of land uses are going to support that? What do we need? So to guide that, RDG went through some other assumptions with you to establish scenarios. And we really landed on, we need about this much land with a kind of medium density, which means we're going to have some low density. It's not that everything is uniform, but we're going to have low density development, but we're also going to plan for some high density development and kind of have a medium level averaging across the board as we grow as a community. So there was different ideas that you could have gone with. You could have said, we want the most compact development pattern possible. We want a lot of medium and high density and very low density. You could have gone the other way and said, we want to spread out as much as possible. And you can see how this would have shaped some of the other work that we would have done. But we focused on this kind of middle of the road scenario. And what that led to was an exercise with RDG and our engineering consultants, HDR, to take the population of 15,000 people and really place it in 4 different directions, not spread it out and dilute it, but to really emphasize what happens if you grow directionally to the north, the south, the east, or the west. From that, we identified infrastructure needs, different land use patterns, and you can see even the land use patterns that are illustrated here with oranges and yellows being residential and red being commercial uses and the purple being our employment or our industrial uses. We had different patterns, and part of that was just to kind of flesh out different styles of development to give you a sense of maybe a little bit more compact or a little bit larger. And they weren't confined to just 15,000 people. So when you look at the west scenario, because it enveloped so much more land than anywhere else, it actually had a service population of over 25,000 people if you just went that way and went everything all into that. So it was a good exercise for all of us to really understand the growth potential and what would happen if we did this. So what I would always say to you when we did this, the plan's 2040, but the scenario evaluations are much beyond that. So it really sets us on a path for not just getting to 2040, but how to continue as a city and then build upon our successes and build upon our investments to really support longer term growth and not just have 20 years might seem like a long time, but it's kind of short-sighted when you think about infrastructure deployment. So this really helps us understand what are the big picture needs as we go even beyond 2040. So because that was, an Ames of 100,000 people, council needed to prioritize. So what you ended up selecting after we had gone through kind of where are these breakpoints in the ability to serve these areas, you picked tier 1s, which were the blue areas in all 4 areas. And tier 1 was meant to be essentially immediately or readily developable. You did not have to deploy some level of substantial infrastructure to see some growth happen in those areas. Tier 2 does have, if you jump to tier 2, you would have had a gap, but it builds naturally off of tier 1 at the same time and kind of fills out those growth areas to get a population density or a commercial density. So when we selected the blue tier 1s, you also chose tier 2 in the west, north of Highway 30, because west was broken up kind of north and south. So we focused on the north side. And then in the south, you also picked tier 2 as a way to kind of fill out the south again, get more population density and concentration there. And with that, we came up with, magically, a population yield of about 15,673 people. So that fits the target of what we were trying to do. Now, what was not accounted for in that 15,000 people was the other infill choices that we're going to make. And this plan doesn't deal just with the expansion of the city. Council is pretty clear that there's other goals for the community besides just broadening our city limits on the periphery of the city. So in addition to that growth, you do have options for infill development and redevelopment to really augment that total options of housing and commercial uses in the city. Whoops, one too far. So with those land use maps and those discussions, council then started to walk through over those other workshops, addressing the issues of land use, the environment, mobility, parks and open spaces, neighborhoods, housing, and community character. So this plan is fundamentally focused on the built environment. We're not talking about how to program parks. We're not talking about how to operate SciRide. We're not talking about how to have an energy portfolio for Ames Electric or how to work with the other electric utilities on how they do services. What we're really focused on is how do the people in Ames interact with the built environment, and how do we support the infrastructure and the other built environment components that we want people to be able to utilize, to enjoy, and really are why you live someplace in the first place and have a quality of life that you respect. So this plan starts out with a vision. The vision statement is really to guide the creation of the plan. We had this as a bit of a rudder at the very beginning of this, and then we dive into more specifics. And each of these elements has another vision statement that then leads to principles to keep whittling down to more focused ideas and more specific expectations as we go along. The discover section here, that's really background information. That's at the beginning of the plan. Some of that might feel new. You probably saw some of it presented to you in different presentations over time, but it is the first time you saw a background chapter. It doesn't have policies or goals in it, so I'm not personally going to spend a lot of time on that tonight. If you have questions about what's there, or you think there's something that, why isn't this in the background, I'd love to hear that tonight as well. And that kind of goes for everything that we're going to talk about tonight. The PowerPoint's focused on the goals and principles, but I have the whole plan here, and we can get into the questions on the action steps, or if you want to know where is something at, we can definitely pull that up. We're not limited just by the outline of the presentation tonight.
Kelly, I do have one question here.
Yep.
So I'm trying to remember. I apologize. Some of this feels very fuzzy. But did we talk about affordable housing as being one? I mean, it's one of our council goals. Is that something that should be a plan element? Is that the kind of characteristic that we would say expresses our values as a community?
So that's the great question for tonight. So one thing that is a staff edit that we're going to make: neighborhoods and sub areas should really be neighborhoods, housing, and sub areas. Because when you go read that element, the first half of it's about housing policy. So it talks about housing within neighborhoods, but it does also lay out the groundwork about why we need affordable housing and what some of those production needs over the next 20 years are. So that chapter includes housing policy that would address affordable housing needs.
So it's nested within that sub?
Yeah, it's within the neighborhoods and sub areas, and it should, to be appropriately titled, it should probably be neighborhoods, housing, and sub areas, or housing, neighborhoods, and sub areas. Housing should be in that title.
So I'm just brainstorming. I'm curious if the council would have an interest in this. Just because of the way in which this page lays out, would it be appropriate to have even a parenthetical to reflect affordable housing as a component of that? And maybe I'm overthinking this, so you can tell me if I am. But at some point, you want one of your key organizing documents to express your high-level values for the plan. I'm going to be okay either way. I was just curious if council members had interest in that.
So in my sense, definitely adding housing to the list highlights that it's an issue for the city. Adding parentheticals would probably force you to think about maybe what's the most key point in each chapter then. And then you're starting to, at least this is an introductory page in the plan, just to lay out the flow. So I agree with housing, but if we want to add more notation to it, I would need to probably think about how that works for all of those.
Maybe we can just sort of bookmark this and come back if we later on think it's of interest. Thanks.
Well, and I like the suggestion. I mean, with housing in there, because you said on page 113 there of that report, it's all about affordability. That particular pages in the.
And I'll be going through those high level, not going through all the numbers, but going through again where the policies and the principles, or the vision and the principles and actions fit, and then we can come back to it and discuss it there and how we think it fits.
I mean, imagine if we did this 2040 plan and there's no affordable housing in any of it.
Right.
I think we look back and say, well, we sort of missed opportunity for us. So
I'd say think that through, because I would say one of my critiques of the current plan is housing is not at the forefront of that plan. It talks about land use and patterns, And then housing is buried in the plan under an optional section, and there's not actually directive policy about housing. I think we've done that differently here and tried to bring it forward in that chapter. But if you think we're missing it, those are the kinds of things that we want to hear about the plan. So the next page is again kind of giving you that 1-page summary of what's the whole comprehensive plan. So the vision statements they're not verbatim necessarily of what you've seen. As we worked with it, we tweaked some of them a little bit to probably fit a little bit better with the principles and actions as we went. But none of them are so new as to be something you've never seen before. So look at those as you read the plan. And we brought these unifying themes. We talked about this as we did the workshops, that there are some cross-cutting issues across the plan. And as RDG identified these 4 unifying themes in your last workshop last year, as things that kind of resonate throughout the plan. They're not principles or guides on their own. They're more messaging about values that the community has and what you should see in this plan as you read it. So you don't have an inclusivity chapter. You don't have a health chapter. You don't have a choices chapter, but they're ideas that should be embedded throughout the document.
There are a couple things about this page that, well, the English professor in me was really coming out.
Sure.
First of all, in our diagram, inclusivity is spelled wrong. So
okay.
That's, to me, that's kind of important because it's one of those unifying principles.
So sometimes like in this one, the font translations don't always go great, but there are also spelling issues that we will catch.
Yeah, well, and I'm going through the plan because I just can't not go through the plan. But I'm not sure what that first inclusivity statement is actually. I mean, I guess I know what it's saying, but it's not very clear to me what the city's greatest asset is. Is it?
It's the people of Ames is what we're trying to communicate and to be as broad about who the people of Ames are.
Okay, so I got thrown because of the is instead of the word are, because you are talking about all those people and the different categories, right? So I thought I was missing something when I read it, and I just wanted to clarify that. And I think the neighborhoods, housing, and sub-areas vision, possibly that would be a place where we could account for the affordable housing by maybe saying specific needs of the community for housing variety and affordability, and then economic development, infrastructure, et cetera. Would that account for what Tim is missing?
It could. I mean, at this point, I'm probably not going to critique everything you guys say. I think you guys have to absorb that and think about that. I will say on the vision statements, as I was looking through them, because of edits that I made or other adjustments that RDG made, I would say the language is not consistent. Some of them say Ames will, Ames is. Mm-hmm. So we want to come back to that and make that kind of the same style choice without changing the meaning. So we would work on that as well. But if you have more than a style choice, that's something the council would have to give me direction on.
Okay. There are a bunch of places in this document where there are incomplete thoughts. Yep. And I don't know that that's really something that we want to take up, or if that's just an editing issue. I just
if you have those, we'll pass them on.
Yeah, I just figured
having other eyes read it is helpful. So
so if somebody has markups on a page, like those kinds of edits, typos,
even
things
grammar
that you have seen and noted, I'm happy to take those pages and we'll work to make those corrections. And then if we decide that, oh wait, this brings up an issue that's beyond an edit, then we can bring that back to the council to get direction on.
Okay.
So if you have that, pass it along anytime you want.
I stopped because it was driving me crazy. So I will do the whole thing though.
One more tweak on the park trails and greenway. So I say that expresses a traditional view of trails.
Okay.
I'm curious. I think we have a slightly expanded view of trails as really being one of our modes of transportation. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just a recreational amenity.
Right.
So I don't know if that could be tweaked. You can play with the language.
Sure.
Oh, that's good, I think.
So we definitely have that built into the policies, but it's not reflected in the vision statement. I don't disagree with that at all.
Otherwise, I think it's really good.
So as I said, I'm here to talk about any page in the chapter. If you've cracked it open and you've seen something that you want to talk about, anything that I obviously I can't give you a 130-page PowerPoint. We wouldn't ever get done with it. So I'm trying to hit the high points, but anything that I missed and you want to talk about, please bring it up tonight as we go along. So I'm just going to go in order of the plan. We're going to start with land use and growth. The vision statement is pretty much consistent with where we were over a year ago when we started with this. It's trying to balance that we have environmental expectations as well as we do want to grow. We're not a city that wants to be happy with where we are and what we have and say no growth. So we want to take a balanced and sustainable approach to the growth of the city. So in this chapter, in each chapter, I'm going to give you some bullet points, which are my kind of layman's summary of what's in the chapter. These are not verbatim policies, verbatim principles, or anything. So this is trying to give you a very quick summary of what you would find in this chapter when you read it. So it's going to deal with the patterns of growth, which is what you would expect. It's where we're going to deal with the expansion of the city, some of the designations for where infill can happen. Right now it includes the scenarios and tiers background. It's very possible, just to kind of thin the chapter out, we may move that to an appendix. I think one of the references even says that stuff's in an appendix right now. I think, to me, as you go away from 2021 with this plan, the history of the scenarios will mean less, and it probably belongs in an appendix so you can focus more on the policies and the categories that are here. The future land use map is usually the most identifiable element of a comp plan. This is the home of that. And there's two new things in this chapter that you haven't seen. The development compatibility guide, if you can remember back to a year ago when we talked about land use categories and housing, we had a lot of discussion about character of neighborhoods, existing areas. Do we want interventions to allow more housing, more accessory dwelling units, different kinds of infill options that are now precluded in the code? One of the big things that you asked for was for RDG to not just think about policies that generally support those things, but how do you put those into action, or what should be expectations going forward? So RDG put this section together, the Development Compatibility Guide. It's kind of like a primer to a zoning ordinance, the way they've done it. It has matrices, which I'll show you in a second, to try and line up land use categories with uses. What are possible incompatibilities that happen? Should it be allowed by right? Do you need a special permit? It's trying to give you an idea of what you should think about if we do, or when we do, infill throughout the city or in specific areas of the city. So that's new, and we'll come back to that. And then the other one that is new for you is the urban fringe policies. We did all the scenario work. I told you that at the end of the scenarios, because the work supports the growth of the community beyond 2040, staff's perspective is we need urban reserve. We need to have clear statements about we want to protect areas that we think we can expand into over time from inefficient rural development. So we'll go through that tonight too and see if I have that captured as well for you. It also deals with growth and annexation and some of the infrastructure planning needed to support the expansion of the city. So there's a lot of principle. It's a long chapter. It's the longest chapter in the plan. Really, we have two topics within one chapter. That's why it's so long. So we have the growth principles that really talk at a kind of a broad level. And then you have the land use principles that are going to relate to how the land use categories and the land use map is meant to work. And it's about how we want uses to be allowed, how we want them to work together, what's their compatibility, how do they fit other situations like relating to the transportation system, how do they fit into a community character discussion in terms of design qualities and compatibility as well. So this is an example where the growth one has 35 actions to support those 6 principles, so about 5 or 6 more specific items. And actions in general are there to give a little more context. Some of them are very specific, say do this, the city needs to develop this plan. Some of them are just more context so that there is some interpretation, or hopefully less interpretation and more clarification of what's expected with these principles. And this varies a little bit throughout the plan. Kind of there's a little different flavor in each element about the level of how actions work versus policy. And part of it's because actions work well when there's a clear thing to do. They don't work well when it's more of a policy that you might rely on over time to deal with questions about change. And then the land use principles, they have fewer actions because it's really the land use categories and the map. So those ideas should be translated onto the map. And when you go through the land use categories, what's important in that is not just the nature of what's being described, but how would you deal with issues that arise within that category? So it talks about development should address these issues, or minimum density is expected within this category. City council may need to review the zoning ordinance to address high density standards for this zone to be more effective on reaching our goals. And to help, because it's really all new categories, we're not using anything from before. You'll notice on each land use category, there's in the upper right hand corner of the page, it describes the zoning districts that we currently have that would match it. So if you see traditional neighborhood and you're going, well, what the heck is that? Because that doesn't exist for me. You can go see, well, oh, that means RL zoning, and it means UCRM zoning. And you can get a sense of then where those things are in the city. Now, RL could be in more than one category because it's not just in the oldest parts of the city. It's in a lot of the other parts of the city too. But it gives you an idea of a zoning translation. Don't read that to mean that we're never going to change the zoning ordinance. It's there right now as a bookmark to help you translate the new language to how you see the zoning map work today.
And that's
Kelly.
that one chart that's where it's got on the right-hand side.
Nope, it's here. I didn't actually insert this slide, and while I was
Oh, I
talking, I
see.
wish I had.
But it also would be on that, probably. I was thinking of the, there's a chart on page, 70,
Sorry to hand that up.
where it's got what I assume are the land use, the land use categories on the left, and then all the current zoning districts across the top.
On page 70.
Yeah, of 130, whatever it is.
So what I was talking about, here's an example. So at the top of residential neighborhood 5, applicable and existing zoning districts, it has RH and FPRD listed as those things. On the other pages, it's village, it's RH, it's a PUD. And you were saying on page 70, that's when we're going to get into the compatibility
That's,
categories.
That one.
Yeah, so in this,
that one.
this isn't exactly that, but yeah, I think it fits what you're saying, but I would rely more upon the specific notation on these pages right here. So this is the more direct and clear link. That chart is a generalized version of it. So both can work, but I would rely on this more than the chart.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I appreciated having that near campus overlay to solve the problem that we had initially with I guess it was university neighborhood or something
Right.
that didn't quite fit what was happening there.
Yep. And we'll give you, and I noted this on the draft that you have, that you're not expected to read this insert map that we have right now. We'll get you a larger PDF to review, and one that for the public that they can review as well. But for tonight, this is what we have. And I don't think this will be in the final version, but you can see in the gray, you can see these areas here. These are the ghosted out boundaries of the scenarios. We have an actual urban reserve map. If you didn't have that, you would have said, well, maybe that's the urban reserve, but I went further than that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So the gray areas kind of represent the other scenario evaluation areas, but don't have exactly land use plans attached to them.
Kelly, I have one question on your under your policy framework. Item G32 says, consider options for integration of housing choices within new developments, such as inclusionary housing standards and incentives in zoning. I wasn't aware that we had talked about, a council had talked about that, or something I was really.
Which number was that again?
G32, it's on
Page 35.
yeah, page 30, page 34, 35 of the PDF, yeah. Yep. It's very in the middle column, top one, G32.
Yep. So I think this is why we're here tonight. There was a lot of conversations. There was, again, mostly bullets, and not all the action steps would be there. I would say if we went through the full record of housing meetings and land use, we talked about what are things you can do to promote affordable housing? And that's where this action step is saying, if you're looking at increasing housing choices, it's one of the things you could look at. I don't think it commits you to doing that, but it's something that's suggested as something to evaluate. And those are the kinds of things that if it's never going to be evaluated, council should have it stricken from the policy. If it's something that's maybe pertinent over the next 10 to 15 years, then it should probably stay in. And then council would prioritize when you get to those kinds of issues. And I know we've talked, when we did the PUD overlay, it's a good example of, we talked about how much is mandatory in terms of a mix of housing within a development versus the PUD overlay, which made it optional for the developer to mix housing types. So we have had conversations in the zoning, more so than maybe directly in the comp plan. So I could see why you would feel like, well, we've talked about that. Is this consistent with those discussions? And I would say for a lot of this, the plan for me, I would say it is not very directive and mandatory, in my opinion. It's leaving a lot up to zoning issues to be resolved. And maybe that won't be your conclusion after you review the plan, but I think it identifies a lot of issues and policies, but doesn't commit you necessarily on a lot of them to any one thing, and expects zoning categories or other studies or something to be the final decision about those policies. So think that through while you're reading this. Does this really commit me to something? Is it identifying something for me to study? Those are the kinds of things I think, as you start to use this plan over the next 10 years, those will be the questions that are in front of you. Does this policy mean I have to, or does it mean it's something we want to evaluate?
Yeah. And I was thinking to that one specifically, it's not saying that we would go right out and do any sort of, requirement, but the word incentive in there, even, we've talked about that, rather than a carrot to help people along with that. So, I mean, I think that's seems okay in there.
So for example, in the PUD overlay, you aren't going to remember this, but we did add that we can reduce parking if you do affordable housing. So Ames has never had that option before, but if you do a PUD, council can now reduce parking to not penalize a family-sized unit the way we would a student-based unit, where we expect 4 people with 4 cars in a 4-person household. A normal apartment would not own 4 cars, so we don't have them park it that way. So that's an example of giving an incentive in zoning to encourage different housing. Doesn't necessarily mean financial. It can be something that helps the developer's bottom line, but isn't necessarily a direct subsidy from the city.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good one.
Kelly, while you're back on these Gs, I had a question about G8. There seems to be a kind of afterthought at the end about Ames assets and regional position, and I don't know what that's doing there. I'm not really sure what it's, how it relates to supporting existing commercial areas.
I would say that is a leftover thought that doesn't belong. That's my first thought.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of them.
I was just afraid I was missing something important.
No,
there
and
about that.
I took this as a draft, and that basically they're getting a lot of stuff put down, and I caught that too, and there's other ones as well. And the point is that it's just maybe to help Kelly is just as you go through them, just kind of highlight those so you can kind of catch them and clean them up.
Yeah,
there's some punctuation, there's some missing.
Those are the kinds of things. If you pass that along, that's great. I mean, we'll eventually catch this stuff too. It was important to get it out to you so that we're on the right track and not perfecting the wrong document. But there's definitely perfection necessary in this thing.
Well, and back to G32, you answered the question. And the point is it's not just council and staff reading. It's going to be developers. It's going to be the general public. And I think I'll make sure that people understand this is not binding this council or future councils to having to do what is in here. And I think the wording is right. And I agree with you, Bronwyn. The way it says consider, it's not saying shall, it's
Right.
consider. So
I
I just
think
want to tease that out. What's the purpose and how is this going to be used so that we're clear on that? And the wording becomes very important.
So I would say that's a great transition to G1 and G2. So G2, I feel, is mandatory. It's reflective of our current minimum density policies. So when it says establish 3.75 units per net acre, that's our current standard. We intended to pull that forward and still be mandatory. So I hope that one comes off as mandatory, not suggestive. And there's not a lot that are going to be mandatory, but that's a good example of one that is.
Well, then go to G3 then, when it says maximize use of existing infrastructure. Is that implying that you can't do something before first maximizing? And I don't want us to get in the weeds tonight, but I'm just trying to understand the framework as council's going through, as we're kind of reading through it. How should it be interpreted so that we don't adopt it and then 3 months later we're having to undo it or change it or amend it because we didn't really think through it. That's all.
So I think G3 to me is like kind of classic planner speak, where it's emphasizing what we really prefer by saying maximize, and it would give a council a policy reason to say no to something, but it also doesn't say I have to amend the plan if there's another option that's reasonable. And that one has more policies. G3, there's more discussion about infrastructure deployment and the capital improvements plan later on. So I think when you don't read them in isolation and you read it with more text, you get that same emphasis. I think we have, I don't think we said leapfrog, but I think we said something about incremental development abutting the city is our preference, right? Like we're not trying to put a mile of sewer out and then see what happens. We could do that. That's possible. Maybe you need to do that to spur and reach your housing goals, but it's not our preference.
Yeah, I think it's later in the I'm not sure where it exactly is, but I highlighted it was that it talks about going to a tier 2 before going to tier 1. It's like, well, how's that going to happen when you have all the utilities that have to go through tier 1 to get to tier 2? So point being, I think it's just more or less you've answered the question. And I'm trying to parse every individual item, but just so it's helpful to understand how you want us to read it. If it's implicit, establish, shall maximum, or use the word shall, that's basically is we're going to do this, or council's going to do this. If it's consider or other things, it'll be helpful to know that it becomes optional, a lot of flexibility for council.
In that same vein, on G8, we have recognized Campustown as a small business opportunity area for local and homegrown businesses. And yet council voted down the element of the URA that would have supported that. So I don't know what recognize there means and whether that obligates us to revisiting the urban revitalization criteria again.
There's no way it would obligate you to bring something like that back. So I think you're trying to put into words to a general audience that isn't following everything that we do. What do you think of Campustown? I think the city thinks of Campustown as a small business, not a national retailer kind of center. I know we've had some move in, but the history is not that. I think the city talks about supporting small business here. This is the only thing in the whole plan that probably says anything about supporting small business and that kind of student life environment from a commercial perspective in the plan, because we don't have an economic development chapter. So we're trying to give you a sense of the character of an area rather than say we have economic development policies for businesses in these places. So I anytime something's recognized, plan for, emphasize, those are not mandatory kind of words. But if you don't believe it's a small business area, then that policy doesn't belong at all.
And just to clarify the interpretation and force of this document, the way I read this is if we go back to G1 and G2, they do say establish this, do that. Just the fact of them being there doesn't actually accomplish what it says needs to be done, correct? This says that, for example, if you are doing something to the zoning ordinance, it had better agree with what this directs us to do. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think if there's so as we start to probably get through the public comment and realize how people react to this, maybe the word establish is not the right word there, because you're right. It feels like it's telling you to do something in the zoning ordinance rather than apply it to a project. Now we have it in the zoning ordinance, so that's good.
Yeah. But for example, if we were to do something spuriously in the zoning ordinance that flatly contradicted G1, then we'd have a problem that we have to solve, right? We could come back and amend this or something.
Yep. I would say if you adopted a zoning district that now allowed 2 units per acre in a growth area, staff would say that's inconsistent with your comprehensive plan. You should deny that request.
Sure.
You should amend the comprehensive plan first. You should do either deny it or amend the plan first before adopting a zoning standard that conflicts.
Good. And Also, sort of a general process question. I'm wondering, I think some of us are going to send some edits back and things that we noticed in this draft that either need to be fleshed out a little, or maybe some spurious lines that are deleted or something like that. And I'm kind of wondering, when should I really sit down and read it the most carefully? Are we going to have a change tracking process going forward? That would be really helpful if we could do some redlining or something. So I guess what I'm hoping for is that we can do a round of sending some edits to clean up the document and deal with some of these higher level issues of just how to read it. And then we can watch changes get made to it going forward, because we can't read an 130-page thing repeatedly.
Good point.
So I would say it's normal. I think we're feeling it out here at the steering committee draft. I would say it's very normal once you have what you call your official draft. Every edit from that point on is tracked and noted on the page. You know, in the August draft, it said this edit September 14th, this edit August 15th to get to the final one. So there's a tracking scheme once you get to your solid base. So if that's something we need to do now, from here on, at least internally for the steering committee, I think we'll have to talk about how that works. But absolutely, once you get to the public draft, you keep track of every edit from there on out.
I guess my suggestion would be to, after this meeting, we send some feedback to you, and then you start with another clean draft, and then change tracking happens from that point going forward. That's kind of what I would suggest. But I mean,
So I have
council
a
thinks.
feeling that we're going to be sending many of the same
Yes,
right.
comments.
That's right.
I was planning on letting you do them first, actually.
Yeah, well, it could take a while.
So August 3rd is 2 weeks away.
Yeah.
If a lot of comments come in on July 28th, they're not going to be in front of you on August 3rd. So it's more like, if you have stuff this week that we can incorporate and get ready, we'll do what we can. But not knowing what I'm getting, it's hard to promise what you're going to get back by
course.
August 3rd.
But let's clarify. Shouldn't we just show the tracks? We'll check changes from this point on.
That would be easiest, I
I
suppose.
think we want to do that. So why don't you just send them? And we'll show them as the first.
The public draft wouldn't include that, though. What I'm
Right,
saying,
right.
it's
No,
not,
no, this
it's
is
not
for
important for
council.
the public to know what you edited to get
Yeah.
to August 3rd.
Right.
No, this is for the
Agreed.
council to build upon.
Is this draft available somewhere on the web?
I have not put it out
Not
there
yet.
because I do not view it as a public draft. I view it as the steering committee's working draft with their consultant and staff
The
team.
problem is people reacting to something you may cross out on August 3rd, you see. So we want to get at least the document you want to present to the public. After their input, after that, we're going to have a robust input session with the public. They may convince you to make other changes, but I don't want to put something on if you're going to change it before the second or third. But that will be on the website.
Well, the other question I would have is, what is the best way for us to give you our edits? Because I've been using Goodreader and just highlighting things, figuring you'll figure out what's wrong here because it looks obvious, but maybe it doesn't.
I don't know that there is a good way, so we'll take it. If you wrote on paper, we'll take it on a PDF. We'll just have to go through it. I don't have a best way to do it. So it's just going to take time of someone to go through everything you send in and sift through it and see if there's anything conflicting. Is it really all the same stuff? That's just how it goes. When you have 7 people providing comments, it's one of the
Yeah, we'll have to work on it.
things you got to
Do me
do.
a favor, will you copy me on that too, so we'll have second eyes on it? Send it to Kelly, just copy me and I'll make sure I'll help him too. So we don't miss something.
Okay. I'm going to go back to the presentation then.
And so just before I forget, maybe one trick that we can use in sending in our comments is if we think that it's something that requires council discussion, then we should just flag it as saying we need to talk about this.
It's policy related.
Yeah, it's policy rather than just phrasing. Maybe
And if you don't, we'll have to try to discern if we think it really does rise up. If you know it is, that'd be great if you would just add that as a note or a comment that, oh, this is something I want to talk with council about on August 3rd. So we started talking about this a little bit, and this is one that I really urge you to think about. How does this really fit in the plan? Is this what you were asking for from RDG about compatibility? So this is just one of the elements that are in there. Marty described it as a 3-pronged test. to talk about use, location, attributes, and zoning, and what would kind of go into what zoning categories may work, which ones are questionable, which ones are absolutely don't work. And then even within that, what are the height issues? What are the setback issues? What are the operational issues that might come into play if you started to allow for a corner store and daycares in certain residential areas, small businesses in different ways. And this is really coming from that conversation about, well, how do we allow for diversity? We don't have a homogeneous one type of neighborhood. If there's some edge changes that would be related to the street that makes sense, and how do we do that? So this is what this section's going for. And to operationalize this, it would really have to get into the zoning ordinance. The last thing we would want to do is use these 3 pages in DRC review to try to decipher if something's compatible or not. I think it's a lead in to how you would have to modify the zoning ordinance to make this work. And another one, I mean, like I said, you need to kind of look through this. I wasn't going to go through each element of compatibility and what all the notation means that Marty had in here.
Did you all know how to apply it? It makes sense to you?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Was this understandable to you? This would be unusual for this to be in a land use policy plan for the reader to understand this.
At this level of detail, I'd probably say, yeah, it's a little. It's here because we asked RDG to prepare it,
Right.
and it might have maybe it has a temporary home, and as we do zoning changes, maybe it comes out, or there's other ways to deal with it. If you feel like it kind of gets in the way of the flow of the chapter, that's an example where you put it in the appendix instead.
Yeah.
So
What came to mind for me was, what does staff think about this? Because you got these 3 different tests, you have these matrices. Is this something which is really going to be helpful? And is it going to be helpful for developers and people who want to come in? Is it going to help streamline the process? They're going to know that they can get answers more quickly this way. I mean, it's easy for us to say, well, yeah, we can understand it, but we're not going to have to use it day to day like you are.
So my view is if we're going to do this, I need a zoning code change to deal with it. I won't be able to use this directly to do that work.
But you are supportive of it, though, and you think you believe in concept.
I think it's informative to the city council who doesn't deal with this on a regular basis. I think it's informative to the public and to decision makers about generally what you should be thinking about here. I would say I hope most planners would think this way if the question was presented to them, and then you need policy direction on which way to land. Do I be conservative and say no, or do I go, it's probably going to work, it's okay? So that's always the tough part in zoning. Do you be conservative or do you be permissive? And which negative consequence are you willing to live with? I always say zoning is equally unfair to everybody. It is not fair. It is unfair.
Could you go back one slide, please? I'm just thinking about the presentation of this one. I found myself a little confused by the fact that there are banded rows, I think just for the visual appeal of the table.
I get
with the colors and
Yep.
And then there are only 2 colors shown on the legend, so I assume that like the things it's otherwise considered inconsistent. Right, that might be good to add that to the legend. Thanks.
She's saying
I found that confusing.
with the gray and the white. You're saying.
Yeah, it's a different color in the draft too.
Okay. So urban fringe principles and policies. There's a couple of different ideas that are going to be embedded at the end of this chapter. The first one is really talking about setting up policy. If we let the 28E agreement expire in July of 2022, then we're back to being subdivision authority over 2 miles of the city. If we extend the 28E, then we'll negotiate with the council about the board of supervisors and their planning staff about how we want to divvy up responsibilities and what common expectations are. But I've written this as if the city is responsible for the administration of their 2 mile fringe area as allowed under state code for solely subdivision. It does not address if you tried to go into zoning. That's a whole different game, and we've never talked about doing that. So this does not go down that path. This is really about subdivision expectations. So a lot of it is very similar into how the current Fringe plan thinks about things. There's a few different policies in here that maybe address new issues that may not have been thought of in '06 when the Fringe plan was first drafted. So I really urge you to look at that. And I'm going to go through blow-ups of the urban reserve so you can read this a little bit better than the one large map, just to give you an idea of what we included in the urban reserve. So the new idea is the urban reserve. The old Fringe plan had very small amount of areas that we called urban service areas, which was synonymous with our growth areas, the Southwest 1 or the Northwest growth area. Urban reserve is much more expansive. It's not just the areas that you can see will grow into for the next 15 or 20 years. It's beyond that. It's really a ringing of the city about possible development areas or possible expansions of the city.
Kelly, before you go on,
Yep.
if you go back to some slide, I think it'd be very helpful, at least in the draft we got. It's a terrible graphic.
Mhm.
And I think that there's not really,
Yeah.
I think there's inaccurate labeling in the legend. But I think that
I liked it.
I like how they
It's
have 30
horrible.
written. Like,
Let's vote on it.
I'm just
So
kidding.
I'll be fair. When I put this together, I have too heavy a weight on the section lines, and I get there's things that are not as clear here as it.
no, I'm just
what's that road? Oh, Interstate 35.
Yeah.
I'm just saying is that as
That's
you work,
called auto labeling in GIS.
It's horrible.
I think it's where every sign on the interstate actually is located apparently. But anyway, point there.
Fair.
Just as you're working through it, I didn't note it, but it needs a lot of help in terms of just clarity in terms of the format.
So yeah, I would say this is a rough GIS map that I put together with RDG, and that it is. So
not
yes,
being
it's-
critical, it's just you asked for some comments,
Yep.
but this needs a lot of help,
Sounds like you-
especially
Well,
in the legend.
Isn't it possible too with some of these visuals, like you do with the tables, to let them be on their own page? I mean,
Yeah. So trying to condense it into the plan to just have it here so you know what it's supposed to be. These are really maps we print out at 3x4 and put on walls.
Yeah.
And when we put them online, they'll be that same scale for people, so you can see them in PDF and get into them. You're not going to zoom in on an 8.5 by 11 page. So these important maps that we use for administration would definitely stand alone. They would be in the plan as a placeholder, but they'd stand alone for legibility outside of the plan.
but they could, I mean, that could be on its own page in here, even if you're not trying to make
Yeah,
it
it could
legible.
be. So
Because it's just not
So
helping.
the current LUPP has it a fold out 11 by 17, but even that, the Fringe plan's fine, but like a zoning map and those kinds of things aren't really legible at 11 by 17.
Mhm.
So yeah, they do have their own standalone pages, and that's absolutely something.
So along these lines, just thinking about how people are likely to use this plan, they're going to be encountering it on the web. They're going to get to one of these pages and they're going to see that's a really cool looking map, and they're going to click on it. And that's what, when you click on it, it should either go to, the highest resolution page we have, or the GIS view, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I think anything that we can do to make this very friendly as an online document would be a really good investment of effort.
We'll do that, and that's why I did the 4 blowups, because I know this was not really legible to kind of decipher what was really covered here with what was on that page. So just to kind of go through, so for the north,
It's pretty clear.
I can't control for projectors. So the beige, it doesn't look good on that one. That one's a little better over there. What we essentially did was in the north, we took the mile north of Ames from 180th to 190th to 180th. And we also went a half a mile to the east of Highway 69, and we picked up a half a mile on the west side of GW Carver and said, these are areas that are abutting Ames. They might not be a growth area right now, but if deployment of infrastructure happens, we know we can serve these areas. So we want to not see ourselves get penned in with rural development in these areas. And it's also valuable farmland in many cases. So that's a good thing for us to protect as well. So that one's probably pretty straightforward because it fits the scenarios. What I do want to highlight on the west is this. I don't know if you see my cursor. So this area right here between Highway 30 and the railroad, That's really the area that the council picked as tier 1, tier 2, and there was some later tier 3. But we also evaluated south of Highway 30. And you may remember in the current plan, that's called Southwest Growth Area. So even though that's not picked, staff believes you should hold that as urban reserve, because we know that just with a different decision about where you align a sewer main, that's just as developable as the other stuff. So we think that's very valuable to hold and not allow for proliferation of rural subdivisions that would preclude us from using those resources that are out there. And we talked about that. There's already an interchange. We already have a water tower. It's pretty easy to plug that into a future land use plan. And then you'll see as we go south, oops, I'm sorry, we should go back to the north. So when we did the scenarios, we didn't really go back and reevaluate everything from the 97 plan. But you do have in the 97 plan all of this area around North Dakota and Onion Creek as the northwest growth area. Now, we left it out in this plan because it does have some issues with access. The grade separation is a known issue that would have to be addressed. It also has a sanitary sewer gap, just like the southwest. Like, again, if we were willing to build a mile of sewer, things change. If we're not, they don't change. So we think this should be left in as well. It's immediately abutting the city. North Dakota feeds right into the city. So if there was a ton of rural development there, we would definitely be feeling the impacts of that as it comes into the city. But we also think, again, if there's other choices in the future, it could be served by the city with some other investments that are done. So we, again, recommend that stay in, even though it wasn't a scenario. And then we did keep a variety of properties kind of encircling the edge on the south and southwest edge of the city that are not ISU lands. So nothing that's shown as urban reserve is meant to say that ISU is going to transition out of their dairy farm or anything like that. But there are some private properties in that area, again, that it's possible to serve either by logical extensions of things we have or maybe just over time. This is where we have the research park having another 160 acres beyond what's even in their phase 4 and phase 5 plans. So there's more land held out here for long-term needs. In the south, this one's really interesting to me. We have the south, the tier 1, tier 2 area that you would expect, and that area around the research park that I mentioned. But we also put in the southeast. So when you first started the scenario evaluations, we had 5 areas to look at, but we ended up walking away from the southeast because it was the most remote at that time compared to the other 4. But as we talked about the south, and if we build an interchange to support the south, then you've unlocked the other side of the interstate as well. So to me, if we have a plan that's talking about an interchange in the south part of Ames, then you should think about how the other quadrant, the southeast quadrant there between Highway and I-35 can fit as well. So I'm advocating that we keep that area as urban reserve as well. And then as we go to the north, this one really fits with the scenarios. Again, it's all the way out to tier 4 in this with that kind of squared off edge. So we're putting it there. And if you remember, this line right here is it's the agreement we have with Nevada. It's a 10-year agreement that says neither of us will annex on the other side of that line. So that's why it's squared off there. And it's really, really remote to think that we're getting there anytime soon. What I do want to highlight is we're not showing really anything in the Riverside area, Stagecoach, as being areas that we ever think that we want to go into. It is very hard for us to service. If that's an area that the county wants to continue the patterns they've had for development in that area, it would be consistent with the Fringe plans policies now, but we're not looking for city growth in that area.
So Kelly, clarify. So what is the value of squaring up or showing the demarcation with Nevada where this is a 2040 plan? That agreement's only for 10 years. So help us think through how to think about that temporary boundary in light of a 2040 plan.
So we could extend it out. If this area, when we did that scenario, that was 20 to 25,000 people that could fit there with just the beige area that I have here. So for us, we didn't even go beyond that because that was so much growth and so far out. We didn't go further east in that evaluation. I mean, you could argue more, but at some point it just does get to be a lot.
So I'm not suggesting that I sense that we're going to do this tomorrow, but for the purpose of drawing the line, it makes sense where the line is. My question is, what's the value of having a demarcation with Nevada when it's not going to be there necessarily?
Yeah, I don't know that we exactly meant for it to be that. It just so happens to be where we drew the end of that scenario in the first place.
Okay.
So I don't think we initially did it just because of the 28E agreement we had with Nevada, but it is also at the same time coterminous with that right now.
The Riverside area is a fascinating area, and I don't know that I've been on council where there's been a robust conversation about that area. So from a planning perspective, how should we think about its place in the plan?
Well, I think based on the patterns that are out there, because it has so much rural, larger lot development, a lot of the usable land spoken for. But with Martin Marietta operating the mine out there, we've had no interest in really spending energy planning for that because so many uses are incompatible with the mine. And then and if you were to intensify, you do start to get transportation limitations. Dayton is one of those impacted roads in Forward 45 in your transportation plan. The amount of truck traffic, the interchange with 13. And we talked about that with the East Grove scenario. If that really happened, you probably need a different interchange for 13th Street and possibly a new one at the Riverside area to kind of get traffic off of Dayton and off of 13th so that it can function. So that area in Riverside seemed very problematic to serve. It's hilly, incompatible uses, so we didn't really focus on that, and we thought that's best left to the county.
But I don't want to spend all the time on this, but I'm curious. I could see a situation where that's just sort of this funny county piece that's right abutting the city. We're not providing police and do we provide police and fire
Outside the city? No.
So it's so close. I don't know. I think that's valuable to think about from a policy perspective. I'm not sure I would land on it, but we've never really talked about that area.
You're talking about Stagecoach specifically?
No, the Riverside area. So east of Ada Hayden.
That would be a lot of inherited county issues if you were to start to try to figure out how to annex. There's just not a lot of available land, and there's a lot of existing residences that are tough to fit into an urban environment.
So just philosophically, I'm not willing to give up land to the county for a long term. This is meant to be a long-term planning document. Agreed. Right now, it's hard to think about, but we're tasked with thinking through this long term. I'm just concerned that as Ames grows, there's going to be this strange pocket of the county right adjoining the city. So we can talk about that later, but I think it's worth thinking about.
I would argue that horse is out of the barn. I think those decisions in the last 20 years already made it what it is with the rural developments that are out there. Yeah. So it just gets very difficult for us to absorb county development that doesn't have infrastructure, even if they wanted to come into the city.
Okay.
Okay. So land use growth, longest chapter. Hopefully that gives you a sense of what's there. And now we're going to move into the other elements of the plan. Some of these are much shorter because they have, not that they're not valuable, but they have less direct applicability to, again, the comp plan's main mission, which is to address the built environment of the city. So we spent some time talking about the vision statement here. This is also where we're going to highlight some of the constraints to growth. This is a composite map that RDG has in the plan, where basically where you see green, different shades of green indicate more constraints in the area, whether it's slopes, whether it's floodplain, whether it's soil types. So this chapter helps just give you some very baseline information about things that as you start to talk about annexation, oh, look, this is, this, so we should be aware of that. We need an environmental sensitive overlay. Also brings some of the natural area sensitivity into the conversation as well. And this is where we put in the placeholder for the climate action plan reference. If you remember that direction from last year, we're moving ahead. And the climate action plan now is underway, but we're not going to wait for that to get through all of Plan 2040. So this is where that main policy about bringing that back into discussion after it's done lives. So the principles are fairly simple here. I think the the important takeaways to me are we're a pretty environmentally conscious town. We have standards in our zoning. We have stormwater standards in our municipal code. Things can be improved. We can add new environmental issues into the code, but this is really the chapter that's saying we want to be conscious of these things, be aware of new issues that arise, apply appropriate standards to them as they do come through the review process. I think the network of green spaces kind of fits in again with the parks and open spaces discussion as well, that it's good to have contiguous and continuous greenways. Just isolated pockets of natural areas are not as good. And as I mentioned, the climate change references here as well. We do have the home for the one policy that we wanted to bring forward about economic development. Ames has been pretty conscious about not having large water users. It can tax our system, may overburden it to little benefit to other residents and users in the city. So we wanted to bring that forward. We had mentioned that during the environmental discussion the first time too. So a lot of this is kind of keep on doing what we're doing and be aware of appropriate opportunities as they arise in the future.
Kelly, back on the policy framework for the land use, there were several references that said, see environmental chapter.
Mm-hmm.
G7 and G8 both had those, and there may have been others. Those are the ones that I noticed. Are there specific references in the environmental chapter that tie into those principles? Or are we just saying, consider the whole chapter in relation to principle G7 or G8?
Let me page to it quick just to make sure I know what G7 and 8 is. So for G8, the sub bullet talks about use economic development and recruitment strategies for non-resource intensive. So it's echoing that same policy in here where we don't want to recruit large water users. So it's kind of just duplicating in this case and saying, hey, this also ties back to an environmental policy. So that one is really replicating the same idea.
Okay.
And then G7 is also cross-referencing that we have a climate action plan policy here that really says so we don't want to just have something that's that significant just hiding in one place, because it will relate to land use eventually probably. So that's why we're cross-referencing in that case.
Is it possible, once this is in its final form, to cross-reference that more specifically? So it's not just look at the whole chapter, but look at chapter, page, whatever,
Yeah.
or?
Yeah, I think, well, the climate action plan, I'm sure will have hefty edits
Yeah.
that involve more than just the environmental chapter. If that's the route we go, we could be more specific on the economic development one right now, if that's a concern.
Kelly, I think I missed it. I think John Dunn would talk about sanitary sewer, certain kinds of sanitary sewer industries too. Did you only mention water or?
I know what you're talking about. It's the chemical load or the concentration.
Uh-huh.
I don't know that we have that. I think we do that through the pre-treatment process and the development review at
There's got to be, you got to talk to John on that because there's certain
Okay.
Well, it
industries.
says economic development priorities should reinforce city prefers low water usage activities and non-polluting industries. That would be polluting of water.
It's kind of just generically non-polluting.
Yeah,
but
Water
I
or
know-
air, I assume, or noise, maybe.
I don't know if you call them polluting, but
Yeah, I'll check with John. I know what you're talking about. I feel like we're deal with that through different elements of the code, but we can highlight that too if necessary. Okay.
well, if you're making a statement about policy on economic development,
Okay. Well, I'll check with Mr. Dunn.
yeah. I don't know what the correct terminology is, but he's concerned about that.
Well, I think back in the intro section, the entire section that was supposed to be about sanitary sewers was not about sanitary sewers. It was a replication of
The previous one.
whatever that was. And I don't remember what it was offhand. Page 25.
Okay. I'll look at that. I mean, I thought that we had a separate thing for sewers. Saying
There's a section and it's titled sanitary sewers, but the text under it is the same text about the water
Oh, okay.
and pollution control.
We moved some stuff around at the last minute there, so I guess we didn't move the right text to go with the heading, is what you're telling me.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll go back and look at that.
It's on page 25.
Okay. So parks, trails, open spaces. This vision statement I think was Tim mentioned a little bit at the beginning. It doesn't reference transportation. We can think about how that fits, but absolutely that ties into the principles of this chapter. So again, for me, what's in this chapter, this element, it's talking about the needs for parks, the kinds of parks and structure of parks. It is not about programming. Specifically calls out that the Parks and Recreation should do an update to their master plan to address what the current needs are and the projected needs for the community. Some of the ideas though that are important here are the service proximity. Parks and Rec would prefer to have neighborhood parks or other larger parks within a half mile of homes, neighborhoods. We talk about a 10-minute walk distance to have access to open space in parks. That might be private space. We have that often in our FSRL developments, that there is some private space as well. So the idea that you have access as a resident to green space in Ames is kind of front and center in this chapter, as well as in some of our land use and zoning standards that we have in the city. The relationship of parks and trails to transportation, that's reinforced here as well, that some trails are recreation, but others are also transportation. And we had this as an emphasis with Keith when we talked about this, a lot of partnerships, working with others to help us be good stewards of parks. We have friends groups, we have other interests that we work with to do the best we can with what we have available to us. So we do have a policy that is pretty important that we want to maintain, or I should say we want to bring forward and probably implement a little bit better, is the idea that with new development, we are seeing park development as well. So we have a threshold that we would like to see 5 acres of parkland with every 1,000 people that we add to the city. Doesn't mean that every subdivision has a park, but as we've identified these growth areas, we should also be identifying where the neighborhood parks would fit best for us. We might not be able to control that perfectly. We never see all the land come in the right order. So we'll have to make choices. So when we talked with Hayden's Preserve, formerly Rose Prairie, we didn't have a park plan for north growth. So we had to negotiate that on the fly in 2015. So it would have been better to have a clearer policy about how and why we want to do that. And that would have been easier to probably make choices early on. It helps somewhat with timing, but it also really helps with when you're trying to negotiate and apply the zoning and subdivision standards. So a developer knows what they're getting before they start the process. So I think that's the big thing here, is to let developers know you have expectations for parkland before they buy land, or at least early on in the development review process, they know what they're getting into.
So do you think that requirement would bubble down to zoning ordinance or somewhere else in the code?
So at a minimum, it'll be here. So at a rezone stage, it could be a conversation. I would prefer to get to a park dedication ordinance. So it's codified. So other cities in the state have ordinances that say developers have to provide X amount of parkland per dwelling unit. And if it's not very much land, then they could pay an in lieu fee for acquisition off site. So that way, again, when one developer has the site, you want the park, you're not asking for too much from them because you have other fees maybe you've collected to do it there. Or if it's large enough, you would do it as a neighborhood park within that development. So we would not be breaking ground there. It's something that is done in other cities in Iowa.
Kelly, I'm very supportive of what you're doing. I think it's great, but I'm curious, are there opportunities, should we be thinking about opportunities for green space within the city for infill? And so where I'm going with this, it'd be interesting to see and sort of think about where our parks are in the community. And are there pockets of our community that really aren't being served with a park? And if that's true, are there ways in which we could prioritize that and make it a goal to see green space developed in those areas?
Yeah, I think so. So it's a little hard to pick up here. This is just for color really on this slide, but this map is in your draft document, and you can pick up then you can identify those gaps where something's more than a half mile. And I know that Keith's very conscious of that. That's why we're willing to do in existing neighborhoods pocket parks, because it's the only option we can get to add land. So like Duff Avenue Park, just north of 13th Street, that's an example of doing an infill, a small park, because there isn't anything else immediately available in that area. So Keith's very cognizant of that. This map would lead you to be able to look through that basic analysis of at least geographically where are there gaps. What this map doesn't do is address actual breaks. So if you have an arterial street, you have a river, those things break the half mile. So really those buffers should be stopped at those hard lines and not expect someone to cross something that's not really available to them to cross. But for the most part, this does a pretty good job of illustrating our park access. So the park master plan would probably be the one that starts to then develop a strategy about where are the highest needs area and maybe policies about what we look at for acquisition. That's probably in the parks master plan.
Can you lay over the top of that a GIS map that shows income distribution?
Yes, you could.
So I don't know. I think that'd be an interesting exercise.
Yeah. So I think we have the income information. That's kind of RDG had some of that in the background chapter. It's usually census tract data, so it's pretty coarse. But yeah, anything that's in a census GIS data set could obviously be overlaid with something that's more like this. It's a little more detailed, and it might reveal some interesting things.
It's difficult to use that data because so many of the census tracts that are student heavy are also the low income areas. And a lot of the students treat campus as their parkland during the day. But it's challenging to use that data. I think Steve and I have found that with the community and regional planning students.
So we could sort of say, okay, we know this is a student area.
Kelly, to Tim's point about the bicycle trails for transportation, we cover that in the mobility section. So is it just a case that we need to do more of the cross-referencing in the parks and trails section?
Yeah,
Maybe.
if we didn't cross-reference, it should. I think the goal with the cross-reference is if you're in a chapter, you shouldn't have to think about, is this a mobility issue? Now, we should be highlighting that to the reader and say, hey, we also think of it this way, go see the mobility chapter. So if we didn't do that here, then yes, there should be some cross-references to mobility.
Yeah, I think I saw it once. I may have missed it because I was reading fast, but it seems like it should show up more often in that parks chapter. And maybe I just missed it because I was skimming.
Okay. I think, okay, we did this one, right? So this is trying to get to that composite map, again, highlighting with the growth areas, some of those things that are more long-term. In the South, we talk about a possible greenway, new neighborhood park. The county's talked about a regional park at the quarry there on the southeast side of town. So those kinds of things, those should be in a plan so people understand when they start to have conversations, is this important to us? Oh no, it's just a gravel pit. Well, it's not just a gravel pit. It might be something else in the future. It's good to highlight those kinds of things. And then it's supposed to also show that meshing of the transportation network with the trail system and get that sense long-term of where trails are going to be as they go through growth areas. And that, like, for example, we talked about in the north, we are now planning to have that east-west pedestrian bicycle trail. We're doing that first leg with Hayden's Preserve to get through that project. Someday the city's got to find a way to get over the railroad or under the railroad, and then we have that full path. So we want things like that in the plan so that you have a reason to start pursuing those projects and conversations over time. So for mobility, a lot of this really relates back to the complete streets. I think we've fixed one of the things that we neglected in the current plan. In 97, we had some very basic transportation policies, but when we became an MPO, we stopped thinking of it at the city level and thought of it at the federal level of what does the federal government expect you to do for transportation planning. So this chapter does not redo what we have to do with Forward 45 or every 5-year transportation plan. This is establishing city policy. This is how we see city roads. This is how we want to make decisions about when we do improvements to roads, how they get done, what the context is. So this really kind of dovetails into the bigger picture analysis of Forward 45, but really is more about our local street system and our expectations. Importantly, Forward 45 does take away from the comp plan the land use projections. So when we develop the transportation models, and I've done the last two, so I know how they go. The transportation consultant asks the planning department, you need to fill it with, here's the number that we're going to get to based on what we have to do for the federal government. Where's it go in Ames? Well, that's where our land use map tells the transportation consultants where to fill in the bubbles, the analysis zones with the uses. So they do work together very well at a high level about how transportation is expected to work and where the transportation and land use are going to go together in the future. So much of this is really trying to use the complete streets concepts, both to talk about how streets are going to function for transportation, but an important piece of that is also can be the community character, recognizing that certain streets have a different character and can support different uses, whether you engage the street or isolate yourself from the street. So there's certain corridors, Lincoln Way is one of those, where we want to urbanize the corridor. We want to engage with the street and think of it as a multimodal corridor, not just a bypass as an arterial street for cars. So this is where the transportation, the land use, and the community character starts to come together. That's that cross-cutting issue that we're trying to get to with multiple chapters in this plan. And again, we have the principles here. There's some of this is to, again, talk about enhancements in existing areas. We're going to use the MPO plans to talk about planning for long-term improvements to new streets and things of that nature. But we also have the contextual design expectations here. This is where we aren't going to be just the default to what the engineering manual says. This is what you do in this situation. This is where Ames makes decisions about what priorities are for walking, biking, and cars, how intersections work, what we want to do for those surroundings. So this plan sets that up as optional components for the city, and to be able to think about context. I think that's where most transportation plans are going, and that's where most land use plans want to be, is thinking context when you're making infrastructure improvements. Any questions about transportation? Any more specific details that are in there? We did talk about level of service initially. That's the transportation metric. That's kind of an all-in one-letter grade for an intersection. And the amount of things that go into that is kind of mind-boggling that you can get to one letter for it. But it is a convenient way to start a conversation about what an impact is and what's an acceptable level of operation in the city. But it doesn't necessarily address safety. It doesn't necessarily address one movement over another. It's an all-in number. So we have some more specific policies about what we expect to see there. So in existing areas, you can't always fix them. So we're going with a level of service D. But when we design new infrastructure, or you're on the edge of the city, we expect a better capacity at initial construction. So it doesn't get to low capacity very quickly. We expect a level of service C for new infrastructure. That way you build in a 20 or 30-year time horizon for the life of that infrastructure. You size it correctly up front. And our current policy is level of C across the city. So the change here is for existing areas to consider D, but new areas to still be C. And that's one of those situations that growing cities get into, is you have to think about how do your existing networks work. Widening roads aren't always the solution. So you have to think about what your capacity limits are and what's acceptable.
And just a comment, a strange thing about that letter grading system is that in this world, C is not really better than D, right? It's just, it's different. I mean, there's a way in which it is, but we're not.
You're using less of the capacity. So A is using very little capacity. Right. B is using some. C is using more capacity. D is getting close to full capacity. E is basically at capacity, and F is beyond capacity. That's kind of the way the scale works.
And so we could get A's by making all of our streets 6 lanes wide, right? Right. And that's not what we want to do.
Yeah, because if you increase the capacity and the same number of cars go, you're going to get a better grade. Whether it's a quality experience is a different story.
By the way, I should emphasize all this is a planning document in areas like Parks and Rec and Transportation. Kelly has consulted with our various department heads. You understand that. So this has the support of all those department heads, planning, the the Parks and Rec director, the transportation engineer, things like that.
I think Keith was here for our workshop on parks and open space, and then and Naming and have gone through mobility stuff extensively to try and connect it together with the complete streets plans and Forward 45.
Right.
Do we really not have crash data beyond 2013? That's what we've got as the big map for conditions for
I
crash.
can't say. I didn't pull that data. So I don't know if that's the data set that's readily available to RDG And I know you can get newer data, but I don't know if you can get it citywide. I don't deal with the crash database. That's something I would have to defer to Damien or to HDR.
Yeah, it just seems somewhat dated looking at what we've done in those locations where there were high incidences of crash.
Okay. So neighborhood housing and sub areas, I think we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. So this is where your housing policies are really going to be found, as well as just kind of generally talking about neighborhoods. So this is where affordable housing, the argument for affordable housing comes in, talking about kind of not just that we need 6,000 housing units to serve 15,000 people, but what does that really mean? How do you break that out into different income levels? We don't build housing really. We build a little bit of housing, but we don't produce the 1,000 housing units you need. That's really the hard nut to crack across the country. Is there's always going to be a low income housing need, and there's only so much that tax and incentive resources are available to do that. So we're really looking at acknowledging that, identifying that affordable housing is a goal or a priority for us, to not neglect it, but it also doesn't have the silver bullet to make it happen either. Other important aspects of this are supporting our existing neighborhoods. One thing that we identified early on is the last plan was really about growth. It kind of locked in some of the existing neighborhoods and said they're not going to change, but that was probably unrealistic. So this plan is reinforcing what I think we're already doing. We haven't forgotten about our existing neighborhoods. Just because we're going to grow doesn't mean we're not going to look at the needs in our existing neighborhoods. There's going to be an augmentation of infrastructure in those areas when we do rebuilds of streets. There's going to be improvements. This suggests that, we have to look at the quality of housing. Do we need rehab programs? Just the ideas that are out there. What do you need to do to sustain neighborhoods? The last thing we want to do is see large areas of the city backslide from neglect, whether it's from city actions or from private property owners' actions. That would be bad for the community. It's very hard to turn those around. Ames is in a good spot right now, and we really want to keep aware of that and keep pushing that those are the expectations of the city going forward. Talked about that. I would say the housing chapter is more qualitative. The land use chapter is the one that's saying these are the types of buildings, the types of densities that we want to see in the city. I think the housing chapter is more qualitative, talking about, well, we expect infill housing to still have design qualities. We expect to see a diversity of housing provided to us. Neighborhood quality, again, is covered here. So it's a more qualitative chapter. It's less directive than some of the other elements of the plan. Is there anything specific in here that we wanted to talk about from the actions or any more with the principles or even the statistics that are in here?
Well, on page 116 of the PDF, there's a chart, projected housing demand by 10-year and price point.
Yep.
How do we think about the fact that what this report is showing that about half of the need for owner occupied is for housing $225,000 and lower in terms of price point? This is additional housing. How do we think about that when, given where construction costs are today? I mean, it's nigh on almost impossible to build, much of a home for $225,000 when you figure the price of land and building materials, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering. I mean, it's one thing to put it in the report and say this is what our need is. The point is, maybe I guess to Tim's point a little bit too, is that I'm struggling a little bit thinking, okay, I don't disagree with the fact that there's a need. How do we get there? Is it just we're just showing this as this is what it says. And I'm not going to dispute it. I think it's true. Actually, it shows that 33% of the 55% of single family homes is $300,000 or less. So I'm just, and this is not picking apart what RDG is doing or what you're presenting. It's just you open the door in terms of asking about statistics.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to help. I'm just trying to think again. You want this to be a good, tangible tool, And then to that other point is total rental occupied needs under $600 a month rent. We need, over the course of 20 years, almost 1,200 units for that. And how are we going to get to that point too? So
Yeah. So I think,
how do we think about that?
so I think when you look at the chart, the total of the 1060 for the 150 to 225, what our DG was trying to suggest was that you have to produce smaller and low cost housing. It can't be single family dwellings. That's why they're breaking it out into those categories. And I completely agree, John, that I don't know that you can produce even what's in here at that $200,000 price point in the current environment. And this is a little dated. This is from data from 2 years ago. So add a little bit of inflation to it. But you're still talking about, a 180 to 240 kind of housing market with what they have here. So I think what the takeaway here is, you can't just rely on single family dwellings. We need to see smaller houses. We need to see different houses be built to have different price points. So council is trying that with the PUD overlay. But other than that, if you just follow normal FSRL, new constructions, 350 to 450 for single family attached and detached dwellings, you're not getting anything. We had the one pilot project by Smart Homes that was under 250 in general for those homes. So
Because it translates over into the chart, which is adjacent price points distributed by development types. And I remember Marty taking us through and saying, where do you plug in, low density, what percent, in the 150 to 225, and that.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, if we're trying to get to, and what the projected needs are is over in the left-hand chart. My question is, are you going to accomplish that by what's shown in the right-hand chart? Because the point is, are you going to have to push more into the moderate, middle, and high density, increasing those percentages? I don't. And we're not going to solve it tonight. I was just curious how to think about what's being put in here and how do you interpret that and use it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be monitoring by the city because we don't build it. So are we satisfied with what we're approving? I think those are the kinds of questions that you have to look. It's going to be a retrospect view, over 3 to 5 years. Did we get what we wanted? Did we reach any of our goals? Those are questions we have to ask in the background. All we can do up front is have land use categories and zoning that says at least we're on the ability to meet that standard. But again, not a unique issue to Ames. I don't want anybody in Ames or the city council to feel like we're not doing our part. This is the same issue across the country. This is the need. This is a national home builders level issue that they understand that they can't produce a starter house in certain markets for a beginning family. It's a national issue because of cost of materials. Some of it has to do with land, but I think we get a bad rap for our land costs. I think land costs are similar in most places, but.
Yeah,
Well,
I
and
remember
big
Tim
part of it.
raised, we tried to subsidize those. It was 75,000, 80,000.
75.
How sustainable is that if government wants to even do that?
Yeah,
You're
so
gonna
that's
create that many homes.
so that's interesting. So what we've talked about is trying to get to a for sale house under $150,000. So Marty doesn't even have that on the chart.
Yeah.
Because the subsidy level is so great.
But I think the explanation on the chart is a little misleading. It says generally accommodated by existing housing. I think what it sounds like it should say is impossible to achieve.
Yeah.
It's not possible to build probably. So
Yeah.
that's what
That's
you're,
right.
that's what
But it
you're
doesn't mean that
Right.
it's satisfied.
New construction. Yeah.
I think what he's trying to say is that at that price level, you have to find something that exists to move into Ames. You can't expect to buy
yeah, so-
something new, right?
Only
Yeah.
possible to be accommodated
Right.
by existing
Mhm.
housing.
Yep.
See, my concern too is council just approved the PUD, down on the south side of town, south of the one that Keith Arnson
Damani, yeah.
is doing. And those are very, very small lots, no basements. They're now start at essentially $400,000 and they go up from there.
Yep. They're not small
And that's
houses.
brand new construction.
Yeah, they're not small houses.
Well, I'm thinking about families with family needs and stuff.
Right.
They're 1,500 square feet.
I think they're more than that.
Yeah.
But that's one of the reasons
They're
we
more
keep
than-
harping on maintaining our current housing stock.
Mhm.
No question.
Make sure it doesn't deteriorate because you're not going to be able to replace those
Right.
in an affordable way. That doesn't even grow your housing stock, but you don't want to lose that.
Yeah, I think what Steve said is spot on. I think that's our affordable housing,
Mhm.
is our existing housing stock. We can't rebuild that.
No way. Yeah.
So as we think about the property maintenance code, having an eye to the sustainability of those neighborhoods is really important.
It
So
makes
they-
some assistance of rehabbing homes too.
That would be, I mean, that's a lot of, you get a lot of rehab for $75,000.
So this conversation is why you have a land use policy that says for affordability, explore changes in standards and incentivizing affordable housing, because you have this chart and this chapter saying, doesn't look like the market's doing it. And none of us have the answer of how to get the market to do it
It won't.
because it might not be possible.
Right, exactly.
Well, and the explanation in the housing type section on page 116 also notes that the trend in rental housing may evolve to fewer multifamily dwellings and into single-family dwellings post-COVID. So there's going to be, if that holds true, there will be even more pressure on the housing market for those inexpensive, currently single-family dwellings that could be turned into rentals because people don't want to live in communal living spaces anymore.
And we've gone through that, right? We can no longer have our rental buffers or any of those occupancy limitations because of state law. And we're very conscious that you can outcompete, rental property can outcompete single family homeowners. I don't think anybody knows how much or if to how long COVID affects people's expectations of housing. Is it going to be for 2 years, 3 years, 1 year, 10? We don't know that. So that's just kind of an evolving issue. But the rental market, I think we say this in here because of the disproportionality, and it's because of the student population. We're 60% rental and 40% homeowner occupied. That's because we're a college town. An average town is not that way. So we want to flip that ratio. In the land use plan, we are focused more on low density or townhome style development and less on apartments. But we can't neglect apartments. I think we got a lot of this. So I'm going to give me a minute here to kind of talk about housing. We all felt like, geez, we got overbuilt in 2019. Well, we did. We had peak construction and a drop in enrollment all at the same time. So it just felt like, oh, there's vacancy. Well, you hadn't seen a vacant sign in 5 years, so you thought everything was vacant. Well, now we haven't approved a new apartment project in 3 years. So these are the kinds of things that cause boom bust cycles in Ames. We do something, then we stop, and then we got to hurry up and catch up again. As we look forward, we got to have plans for how multifamily fits into the community and where is the best places to do that and not be as reactionary as we were. And we're not saying that enrollment's going up by 5,000 students here in the next 5 years either, but the normal demand for multifamily, we've seen it backfill the students. That's what I said. When the students leave, they're not here. Let's see how the market responds. Can we backfill with workforce? And it seems to be the case. I think the rental market stabilized this year, even despite or in spite of COVID. So I think this is a good telling year to see how the rental market works. And I think you'll start to see people want to come back and build more rental housing, and it's not going to be for students.
I will note that the 2021 National Low Income Housing Report that just came out, I think this week or last week, Ames has surpassed Des Moines in the cost of rental housing. Where we've always been in the top 5 in Iowa in terms of cost, but we've now passed Des Moines. So Iowa City is first.
So just as a reminder, I mean, when we think about our housing, I think it's fair. I'm going to channel a little Peter Erasmus. We can't compete with our surrounding communities for providing housing. So Peter always reminds us that a third of our people who work in Ames live outside of Ames, and we're not going to outcompete Slater and Boone and Nevada for affordable housing. So I think we do what we can for this community, but there's a trade-off there. We just can't compete with them.
It's not like new construction in Slater is $100,000 less than Ames. I think the existing housing stock might be cheaper.
Yes.
But your new construction is not markedly different in these.
Correct, on
places.
new construction, that's
Yeah.
right.
So we're to the final element, community character, and this one is a new concept for us. This isn't really in, at least not directly in the current land use plan. So this has a little bit more of those social elements that do tie back to the physical world that we live in, and this is where we're going to find that connection again about place, design, transportation, and land use. Talking about recognizing gateways, landmarks in the city. Acknowledging that, hey, we're a very heavily visited city. We're not your average town. We have a lot of people coming and going in the community. So we benefit from an image that visitors embrace Ames and think Ames is a great place to visit and bring their students or just come in for other events. We also have here where we're tying it into our historic preservation policies. We have our recognition of the arts and the community involvement in this chapter as well. So for the physical part, it's talking about making sure as we grow and develop that we don't forget about having some interesting places. It's not just we want strip malls and single family subdivisions. We want places that people can gather, that they can enjoy socializing. Parks are going to be part of that environment, but the commercial environment's part of that too. I think we all understand how it feels to be able to go out, especially after a year maybe not doing that, to go see people and be involved in a level of activity. And just being isolated in a development probably is not everybody's goal in life. So this chapter is trying to make sure that we don't forget that. It doesn't mandate you do certain things again, but it's trying to articulate our goals to see developments have places that people recognize, have plazas, have placemaking elements, make it interesting for those people. And hopefully that makes it more enticing and attractive to be here as well.
Kelly, I have a question about the vision statement for this section.
Okay.
We specifically call out advancing aesthetic and design improvements. And I know we had some rather negative reaction to our proposed property maintenance changes because people said, well, you're calling out aesthetics and aesthetics they're debatable. What is an improvement, what isn't?
Okay.
Would this suffer if we remove the words aesthetic and design and just said advance improvements that support a spirit of community? I mean,
but not change any of the policies? Because we have policies that say we want to improve the design quality of the city.
I don't know.
So yeah, you can hide them out of the vision. I would push back. Let's not take them out of the policies because I think to me, this is the classic discussion. RH zoning, yes, we need apartments. There is zero standards in RH zoning about what it looks like. It's all density driven.
True.
So if we don't have that expectation, we get a negative reaction. Of course, I don't want that next to me. It's hideous. So this ties into those infill conversations that we expect a better quality so you're compatible with your surroundings. So does it have to be in the vision? No, but the policies are probably important.
Well, I wonder if for me, the question is, I know that we've got those policies and I appreciate those policies, but I don't really think about them as improvements.
Okay.
I think about them as compatibility issues. And I don't disagree that we need improvements that support a spirit of community. But if you don't highlight the aesthetic and design here, I don't think you lose the desire to have that in the zoning and consideration for compatibility.
I'm just reading it without those words. Ames will advance improvements that support a spirit of community, respect its heritage, and create new high quality buildings and spaces to build upon our character. Don't think you lose anything.
It's still in there. Yeah.
I do think though that you're trying to set a standard, and while I understand the property maintenance code is something we got to wrestle with, I do think that if you drive by and drive through communities that really are well kept and have pieces of art that are like downtown, it's beautiful with the art and the maintained planter areas. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think it really handcuffs the council to have to all of a sudden go back and retroactively make every person bring their house or something up to a certain standard. But I think it's something, it's a good thing to achieve or to strive for. But
Is that not covered by create new high-quality buildings and spaces, though? I don't know. I'm just thinking about that visceral reaction that some people had to the notion of aesthetics.
We were talking about an ordinance that would forbid certain things, right? I mean, that's,
Right.
it's really, it's quite different than I think an aspiration to,
aesthetics.
to keep, a high vision. This is not going to have the same sort of force, I think.
I'd be interested to leave it maybe in and get public comment. If people push back on it, I mean, and say, hey, well, why is this in here? Maybe then you could say, well, let's, good observation and pull it out. But you got to take out a lot of these guiding principles because they talk to, like Kelly said, aesthetics and design improvements and visioning. So.
And we did have a council goal about beautification of corridors throughout the city,
Right.
which is, in this category.
Yeah.
Is that it? You done? Oh, you going through?
Yeah, I'm done if there's no other comment there. So
One thing I would suggest when I went through and read it, the section on the right and the bottom that talks about public actions, you want to read that because those are words. I'm sure there are some biases in there, such as a reference to a property maintenance code, which you haven't even adopted yet. So you want to look for words like consider or, we want to make sure we're online with what you're saying. So you might not like some of these or they need clarification. I think Kelly tried to write it so it doesn't bind you to it, gives you flexibility. So look for verbs and what you're binding yourself to. But where it says public actions, that's kind of very important. That's is the lowest level of what they're expecting government to do or us to do on that.
What
Along with the
page are you
guide-
looking at?
All the formats, you'll see a lot of these have in the lower left-hand corner called public actions. Usually it's gold guidelines and then the public actions. I try to focus on those, see what you're finding yourself to or about, and hopefully you're not.
I think the one about the support of property maintenance or the rental code, I think is in the housing one specifically.
Yeah, but it's all over. It's throughout. What
Yeah,
you talked about.
I mean, I
the
think
affordable housing.
That's one thing we want. As you read it, Steve's absolutely right. You should be reading it through that lens. Is it mandatory or not? Is it suggestive? Does it go where you think it should go?
Yeah. Does it say you're bound to give incentives there? You'll consider incentives in certain areas, because people will read it. Different groups will read it and say, see, you have to do this. Or other people say, see, you can't do this. You can't allow this to happen. So make sure the words are important because people will hang on these words. I assure you. So are you done?
Yep. So that's
So remember, you'll send all this stuff to Kelly. Maybe copy me too, so I'll help him. But we're giving you now, you wanted 4 weeks. So we've given you a couple of weeks. He's giving you a little primer. You've read up to this point anyway. Another couple of weeks. We want to come back on August as the 3rd. Is that the Tuesday? August 3rd. And we're trying to find out, is there something you want to remove a section? You want to change some wording, a policy? What we want you to do is at least have a consensus of what the document we should take out to the public for their input. And Kelly's going to have to tell you later on how we're going to get input from everybody for a couple of months. We're trying to get back to the approval process in November. Is that what it is? Or finalize in November?
But the memo I gave you guys at the beginning of June, if we get this out in the middle of August, the goal was to be able to conclude public outreach by the end of September and give you, it'd be very raw because it'd be really rushed to get it to you, but give you that raw community feedback. And then from there, you would decide to move forward with the plan or if you needed to do some other adjustment, but then start that public hearing process with the Planning and Zoning Commission and then getting it to City Council. And that allowed for it to be done by December with that kind of general schedule.
That's when you actually vote on the final document.
So August is not the official approval process.
That's right.
It's just an outreach process to get some flavor of what people think.
But if there's something objectionable you don't want in here, or you want to add something, we want to do that in August so we can take it out to the public.
Mhm.
And then they may remove it again or add some more things based on the public input. But don't think you're bound by what's in here today. We want to see if you want any changes to it.
Can you remind me the last time we met about this? I was just looking in my notes.
June of last year.
Thanks.
Kelly, I did have a couple of questions and a couple of comments. One is the budget slide you showed at the very beginning, with the numbers on the utility improvements.
Oh, the tiers?
You showed, what it's
Yep.
going to cost. That's not in our draft. Is that not going to be in the draft at all? All of ours is just $1
thinking-
sign, $2 signs.
We're going to make a
$3.
separate appendix. Remember me in a separate. sheet
Oh, I'm
from-
sorry. That's a graphic I made for another purpose. I guess I didn't realize that we didn't put it in the plan. So yeah, that was more for a CIP planning purposes.
Right.
No.
Those numbers can be dated really quick. So I don't know that even if we put it in the appendices, I mean, those dollar amounts aren't going to mean much in 3 years
Okay. It's just
But we
curious
are
if
going to update that. Remember that sheet?
for CIP purposes.
But we could share that with the council.
Yeah. So that chart, I think I made that after your decisions, and then to start to work on with Steve and the other departments, where does that fit in CIP planning?
Right.
I'm sorry. I forgot that we didn't put it in.
I just didn't know if that would be helpful to have it in the plan, knowing that it was a certain year dollars for CIP for councils looking at.
Well,
saying,
we'll
hey,
have it and we'll decide what we want to put in because I'll need it when we do the CIP. Are we going to start working on tier 1? And I'm just making this up in the south area because that's the biggest bang for our buck in terms of, new development areas. So we'll have to deal with that, especially with the rescue fund money where we can make some improvements.
Right.
We talk about water or sewer lines in certain areas that could open up areas. Maybe we should take advantage of some of that $14 million to open up an area. Maybe not all 4 or 5 areas, but we'll have to prioritize. I'll give you a recommendation. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made. It's good timing with the CIP.
So those dollar amounts, I think they were in the original presentation. You
Mhm.
just probably don't have that exact sheet the way I was using it.
Yeah.
But we're going to develop one
Yeah, we will have to implement the plan.
and I'll show you that.
Secondly, the page numbers are really hard to read
Yeah.
when they're printed out, so you might want to just look at changing the font so you can.
The white, can we change to a darker color?
Yeah, I think
The mayor's
there's
the one that reads
there's
it.
always a difference when it's designed for online reading versus
Yeah.
print, and this one was not designed for
Yeah.
print. It's-
To what level did the school enter into conversation? Because as we're talking about these different growth areas and you're getting them scattered, I was just curious. I know it was something that was expected of RDG to do early on, because if we start growing in different areas, there's only one option I think that shows potentially a future school, and that's I think the northeast or the east one. But the stress it could put on, like Kate Mitchell, for sake of discussion, down going south. What kind of conversation was had? And I think I didn't see anything in going through the report that indicated that were part and parcel of that and how it might impact them. And I'm not asking you to solve the school problem. It's one of those, but they are going to be impacted by it.
So I met with, I think Eloise and I met with, I think 4 superintendents or other staff if the superintendent wasn't available. You won't be surprised, but 20-year plans aren't really the main interest of a school district. So they were like, well, thank you for that information. Tell me when you have a subdivision. So there isn't much for us to react to. Ames identified, well, Kate Mitchell is at capacity. If you really do this growth, we'd have to figure out, are we going to add on to Kate Mitchell or what we would do? They don't have answers to those things. Same with United. They don't have schools to support 10,000 people and being added to Boone.
Well, Gilbert will be under stress too.
So all of them would have to add facilities. And,
Gilbert will have to add.
so this plan doesn't deal with that as the best we could do. And it would honestly was just way beyond their planning capacity. They don't have plans like this
Okay.
because it's too speculative for them to do budgeting.
But we could share this document and part of the input time. We could share.
Absolutely. That's not a problem.
Yeah,
But
good point.
Also, in the very beginning of the report, it shows population estimates. 2017 was the peak enrollment at Iowa State at close to 36,000 students.
mhm.
This year we just completed, which obviously is an abnormal year, it's close to 32,000 students.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, as you're thinking through and presenting, what would change if we're at 4,000 to 5,000 students less consistently going forward? How would that impact growth projections, rental needs? We did get a local landlord did share with Steve and me just some information on vacancy rates, and they're pretty alarming in terms of what the vacancy rates are for some of the rental properties that focus on students, essentially. And so consequently, I'm just curious,
Good question.
that all, lots happened, obviously. Newsflash, lots happened in the last year. But it's really been huge. And if we're going to see that much, if it was just a few hundred, 1,000, you'd say it's a rounding error. But I'm just curious,
Yeah.
how would that impact some of the things that were?
And I don't think the university's planning on gearing up to 36,000 again.
Yeah, we can't speak for them. I'm just
Well, the discussions we've had, I don't think that's probably going to happen.
Right. No, they're
So that's a good question. How do you
Yeah, so I
respond?
think, so what my recollection of that conversation is that when we got to the 15,000, it was not expecting students to be in that number. That was non-student population. And this chart's a little more up to date where you can see declining enrollment versus the one that's in the plan right now. I think what we talked about as a group and as staff and the consultant was to assume that Iowa State was somewhere between 32 and 36,000 over 20 years. Not substantially more and not a lot less. I think we were already at a lower number than maybe what we would have guessed it when we started for a lot of different reasons. So I think that the basic answer is the 15,000 still needs those housing numbers that are projected in the housing chapter. If you declined in enrollment, yes, more permanent residents could use existing housing. I think the other emphasis is, and we started to get this at the end of this, we don't want to see 4-bedroom suite structures. We don't want niche product. We don't want student housing. Maybe in campus town it's fine, but we don't want to see that on the other parts of town. So we definitely pushed back on that, and that'd be a good thing to continue, is to ask for 2- and 3-bedroom apartments rather than 4s. I don't know that it's going to change any of those projections for need going forward.
So I was trying to extrapolate and figure out what has been really the true non-student growth in our community since 1960. I was trying to, figure that out because I think we could argue for the last 10, 15 years, a lot of the growth in Ames has been because of the enrollment growth in students.
I've tried to look at that a little bit. From the last 15 years, I didn't care so much about pre-2000. It's a little hard to isolate, but one thing you can do, and I think there's an age chart, demographic breakdown. So that's one way to look at it is to see the age cohorts and see the 20, 24-year-old cohort. What was it in 2000 versus now? You can start to see some of those things there. I think you have to look at a lot of different data to feel like you're getting the full picture. Just like I think we had a comment in here, you can't just look at households. You have to deal with the student population and households. You really have to look at the family statistics with the household statistics, and you have to look at the age statistics to try to isolate all this stuff related to income and poverty and different demographic issues. And we've talked about, enrollment does not mean everybody lives in the city. ISU's own statistics say, on average, probably at least pre-COVID, at least 15% are not in the city as a regular resident. For just whatever reason that is, whether they commute or they're not really a full-time student that lives here or however that works.
I think so.
So I don't know that we're going to change projections based on that.
If you're comfortable with where it's at, given the fact, but it is to me, it's a 10 to 15% potential decline in a group of residents that we highly value. Mm-hmm. But just if you felt, well, maybe given that, and it is a change. It's a change that's been the last few years. And the RDG started, a couple of years ago. And so consequently, this has been developing. Now's the time to catch it and make adjustments if it's necessary. If you don't feel it's necessary, then I guess they're being paid to.
One data point now, John, is that the demand for housing right now is off the chart. So if there was a decline in demand, we would notice that in the real estate market. There's hardly anything for inventory right now. So I'm feeling pretty confident that there's still a lot of growth pressure. Did you have time for one more question?
Go ahead.
So, Kelly, I want to go back to a conversation that Chuck had with us when we were working on the downtown gateway zoning overlay. And he brought up the point about the type of commercial that we'd be losing in that area. And and I've been thinking more about this. So when we think about adding commercial in these different expansion areas, it may be a coffee shop, it may be a restaurant, but the kind of commercial area that you see on East Lincoln Way, do you see in your analysis of this, are we going to need more space like that, or do you believe that the space we have is appropriate given the growth projections?
I think you're going to need, at a minimum, replacement for that loss. So we've talked about that a little bit. So you have in the Boone side of the West growth, it made some natural sense to think of Lincoln Way and building off of some of that stuff that's in Boone as that service commercial kind of uses. There's a little bit more of that maybe emphasized on the east side of town too. But commercial office needs to happen in the centers where those are those core areas of the growth areas. We need, even if we're not calling them villages and we're not replicating Somerset is not the tenants in Somerset were not the new urbanist vision of what belongs in Somerset. It's taken over by office uses that had nowhere else to go, right? We have veterinarian medical research uses there. Well, that's not a walkable flower shop destination in your neighborhood, right? So I think that's pretty clear. We need commercial office to exist in more than just on the Lincoln Way corridor or just in the research park. So those core areas need to have mixes of office uses and retail and a little different idea of what that means than how the old village concept was portrayed.
So how do we make sure that we get that when we're on the other side of this?
So this is what's important in this plan. The diagrams for the land use include the cores. It includes that radiating density out. The old plan was a blob and said, we're going to figure out the blob as we go. And then you don't have a commitment to where commercial should be. There was nodes that say generally commercial should be here, but it doesn't say that if we put it here, this is how we can then build the rest of the neighborhood out. So if we stay committed to the plan's vision that says this is an area where we need commercial, might not work today, but we need it long-term to serve these next 3,000 people, and you hold to that vision, you will get that eventually. That's what's going to be incumbent upon the council and staff is to not deviate from that land use vision, because it has a mix of commercial and housing that fits the model that we have all talked about. And if you deviate from that, we have to have a good reason. We might have to make up that use somewhere else if possible, or you may have forego that opportunity.
So are we supposed to build in placeholders for this?
There are on the land use map. So when you go to the land use map, especially if you go like to West Ames.
The shaded areas, right?
Yeah.
But how?
So you see right in this area, those pink and red areas are representing, we expect commercial, it could be mixed use. I mean, it's not trying to dictate Somerset. It's trying to say, we want the most density right here to support transit, use the arterial streets we have, but to put commercial there.
So, and I saw those. What I'm trying to tease out is specifically the service commercial.
Yep.
So not the flower shop,
Yep.
but someone's going to fix your car.
So those areas are at least in the West, they're pushed on Lincoln Way in this area here. So we consciously said there's so much of that out here at the end of this growth area, and we probably would never even annex it because it doesn't really need Ames to exist. But we could see more of that kind of service happening on the Lincoln Way corridor out west. There might be some other spot areas that it happens, but
So does it deserve a different color? I worry about us losing sight. We've spent almost all of our time tonight focused on residential, reasonably
Yeah.
so.
so
I want to make sure we don't lose this.
So it has a new category. One thing in the commercial, we broke up HOC. So we use highway oriented commercial to cover everything from Best Buy to glass replacement companies. Well, those are two totally different kinds of commercial business. So now we have community commercial, which is really those retail oriented uses. So think South Duff for the most part, or North Grand Mall. And then the things you see on East Lincoln Way, motorcycle dealership, glass replacement, UPS, enterprise rent-a-car, auto body shop, those kinds of things now belong in general commercial. So it's its own category. And we have that category out west. So there is two colors out there, hopefully addressing that idea that general commercial is meant to be heavy commercial, light industrial, however you want to think about that.
And so is what you've outlined, is that going to be sufficient? I don't know how to think about how much we need.
I think those are really hard to guess. So the best we did here to guess what mix you need exactly in an ever evolving retail world, it was kind of beyond the Gruen and Gruen economic consultant that we had at the very, very beginning of this, as well as RDG. So we looked at more as land mass and tried to think of it as having a category that preserved those opportunities.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to say, well, we need 8 more oil change shops. Well, we don't even know if cars are going to be using gas and run on oil in 15 years, right? So those kinds of things are really hard to speculate on.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, good point.
Do you want to give a deadline? Do you want when you want the comments back by so you can proceed?
Yeah. So I don't want to overpromise on what's going to be back in front of you on August 3rd. I think without seeing what you all have and what we can plow through in a week's worth of time, I think we need at least a week to be able to take, 3, 5, 6, 7 different people's comments and kind of see where they all land.
Well, it's reasonable. Has everybody read it? Have your comments ready? Can you send them in today?
Or
Yeah.
My
I
comment.
mean, I had a few too. I guess I just didn't know the timing, but that I would like to get people's feedback on while we're here. Just 2 things.
so
Otherwise, I don't have comments to submit so much.
so if we had comments to you, so it was in your inbox on Monday morning at 8:00, that would be adequate to give you all of next week. And if people are already done, if they are done, they can send them to you now. But if not, they still want to keep on.
I need time.
I would say no later than that. I mean, that would give us 4 days to potentially go through a lot, potentially not. But I think we would need 4 days to do that, 4 or 5 days to do that.
I think it's been mentioned. I think a lot of us are going to catch some of the same things, and we're just going to pick them up.
It's
just
going to
gonna
take
be
time
repetition.
for someone to go through everybody's stuff and consolidate it into one thing to get it done. So yeah, I would say no later than Monday morning for us to then be able to crack it open and get working on it.
So the 2 questions I had that I thought it'd be good to get people's input on here. One is, I looked back in my notes, and I did ask for it in June of last year too, but I think this document, I think we should seriously consider a land acknowledgement at the beginning of this document. I think in June of last year, I said maybe in the heritage section, but I now that I think about it, I think at the beginning of the whole document would be a good place, appropriate place to recognize land acknowledgement. So that's something I would like us to seriously consider, and that's sort of a change and something I think would be nice to get in there by August. And then the other thing is, if you could, I just had a question about page 16, the conditions and trends sort of social profile page there. If you want to bring that up, Kelly, just so we can look at it. 2 questions about it, really. One was,
What's the page again?
I think it's 16.
I know what
What's
you're
the one
talking
where
about. Oops,
at least-
23, 22.
It's 17 on the PDF.
Yeah, it's numbered 16.
The social profile.
Yeah, social
That's
profiles.
page
Oh,
Yeah.
16.
I was 1 page short.
Almost there. Yeah. So in the first column, the one about race and ethnicity, are we using shades of skin tones on purpose for our map there?
Oh.
Because if that's not purposeful, I don't know. It
Or
just
if it
struck me.
is.
It struck me as strange. So I would like to use maybe
Yeah,
a
I think it was-
blue or
I mean,
green.
it was just an orange scale ramp, but if
Yeah.
that's the perception, then
It just looked.
Good
It looked
catch.
like skin tones to me,
Okay.
and I thought that was maybe a little distasteful. And then the other question I had is on that second column. At the bottom of the paragraph, it says the only ethnic enclave, in quotes, is located on the west side of town, shown in purple, and that's labeled as uptown individuals on the map. And I thought maybe that was a little questionable too. I don't know what they were getting at with those terms exactly.
I had a question about that too. I didn't know what it
So-
was supposed to
yeah.
indicate.
So what that comes from, I don't know if it's explained very well here. So ESRI is a GIS software vendor, but they also provide a lot of access to data. So these terminologies is really something that marketing people use to break down your buying habits, your income levels, your age. It's
Okay.
and there's different. So some of you might remember Buxton. We used to subscribe to something called Buxton for economic development purposes. They had similar categories.
Okay.
So it's it's more as through the eyes of a marketer than really talking about maybe social and demographic values or makeup of a population.
Okay.
So the purple, the reference here is areas in the yellow and blue making up.
It just says that in the
Yeah,
text at the
Yeah, it
bottom.
Well, the question is
ethnic
how
enclave didn't
important
make
is it
any
to have it?
sense to me, given that it's talking about uptown individuals. It's like ethnic.
I'd have to look
yeah.
into that. I'm not sure what that is.
What's the objective for having it in there? Can I just, if it's going to be offensive, seems offensive.
Well, yeah.
Why not? Can it be taken out entirely, or what are we trying to communicate?
So I would say without knowing what the legend means, it's really hard to know what it's communicating. And I only know because I've seen stuff like this before, that it's breaking out income and age and different attributes that the world knows about you. You could argue that it doesn't have any value and it can come out also.
Well, it doesn't show purple on the.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I'd have
kind
to
of a
follow up on
lavender
even what the
color.
purple is, because I don't
It's
even
that-
see it.
It's the area north of Lincoln Way and west of Dakota. I looked it up. It's listed somewhere that it's,
Okay.
so it's basically the, states like named streets sort of and Ontario. Reliable, that whole-
But that,
West of
yeah. But I wouldn't even
Yeah.
translate that as an ethnic enclave. So I would have to ask RDG if there's something missing on here, because that, I know the color is what you're pointing out, but it's not even purple,
It's sort of a lavender.
It's periwinkle.
sort of. but I wouldn't interpret that
Are you Miss Keller?
that category as being an ethnic
No.
enclave. So I really would have to ask them if there's something
I
missing
don't
on
see
the
it as
graphic.
Okay. Yeah, that one just, I didn't,
And-
I don't know what I read into it, but it
And
was,
if
Well, ethnic suggests some sort of national background or something, and uptown
And then
individuals
uptown,
is
yeah.
not that.
I didn't know what that was getting.
I like the Patriots.
Yeah, that also
That's pretty
struck me.
You know,
as odd.
seriously, I think that whole page needs to be really looked at through a different lens, because I think that there's also what talks about low health in those different areas too. And I just think that there's some categorization there that I would question why it's in there. What are we trying to accomplish? Why is it important for an LUPP, document? But so just encourage you to talk
I
to
think that the intent, whether it's coming through or not, I'm not going to argue. I think the intent was to give you maybe a different lens to see if there's equity issues that pop up across the community.
Yeah, and that
I
part,
I would argue the middle one is not doing that.
right.
So I think that the social profile with race and ethnicity could be helpful. Potentially the health lens is, again, without knowing kind of the black box behind it, maybe you don't know what you're looking at exactly. It's a question whether you want it in the plan or not.
I did like the part about it identifying priority areas for exploring barriers and inequities and the means to address them. I liked that.
But I mean, I would argue like even
Function,
in
but-
East Ames where it says high health issues, well, very few people live in that area. So it's a huge swath of land with maybe a couple hundred people in it versus other census tracts in the city.
Right.
So it's something. I don't know that I would make policy decisions off of it, but that's kind of why it's in the background section rather than a land use, rather than one of the elements saying this is the issue and this is how we're going to
Yeah.
affect
And
it.
yeah, that made sense. Thanks
So-
for
so could I have,
entertaining those questions.
Do people want to take the social shed, the middle column out?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We shall do that.
And land acknowledgement, was that okay with everybody?
Yeah. I think we should
Yeah,
draft
so
something.
Iowa State has already developed a land acknowledgement. that-
certain wording or that's acceptable.
Well, I was just doing a search and there are some guides to doing one, but Iowa State has.
They have
do
one
have
that
one,
focuses on Iowa State University is located blah, blah, blah. It could be Iowa State University and the city of Ames are located. So I would think it would just be a question of asking Iowa State if we could adapt their land acknowledgement.
There could also be a difference between the land that Iowa State is on and the city of Ames.
It's- It's not, as far as I can tell. I looked at it for my presentation, and as far as I can tell, the tribes are very broad in their,
There are a few templates, but I think Iowa State's obviously be a good one to
Well,
partner.
if you have suggestions, why don't you pass them on to Kelly and he can work with RDG on that then, or if you have some resources.
Cool, thank you.
yeah, I would think just checking with Margot Foreman in the vice president Sheriff's Office for Diversity and Inclusion.
Anything else? Robin, anything else?
That was all I had. Thank you.
David?
I do have a question. So thinking of the weeks coming ahead, again, we are hoping to have another draft to look at on August 3rd, and we'll talk about it. And I understand that you're planning to release the result of that conversation to the public on August 17th, I think you said?
Hopefully the 16th is our goal.
16th. And so I guess if we make changes during the August 3rd meeting, are we going to get a chance to look at the result of directing changes? I mean, who knows what we'll say, but is that the intent? There is a meeting in between where we could do it.
I had what I was hoping for on the 3rd is black and white. This is what I want in the plan or I don't want in the plan. Not, can you write me something like this? So I was not intending to come back to council because I thought any direction I got would be black and white and there would not be interpretation by staff or RDG on what we're supposed to do between the 3rd and the 16th.
Okay.
But again, if the comments come back differently, we can adjust. On the 10th, neither Steve or I will be here. So you guys can do whatever you want.
So we can go nuts.
Yep. Eloise, you guys can go to town with Eloise and rewrite it.
Okay, so it sounds like we should aim to be as specific and final as possible on August 3rd for this phase of.
Yeah, that's what I'm really hoping for. If there's words, I mean, literally, if it's wordsmithing, that can be what's happening on the 3rd.
Thanks.
Anything else?
I see you found the sanitary sewer.
Yeah, I'm looking at that. I'm like, that's not what I thought it was there. But I know we moved some stuff around at the very last minute, and clearly didn't go where it was supposed to go.
Rachel found the land acknowledgement that Iowa State has. It looks very appropriate. I'd be very supportive of that.
Can you email me that link, Rachel?
Yeah, I just sent it. That's what the sound was.
Anything else?
Oh, there. We'll forward you that email.
Okay.
Do you have anything, Rachel, that you want to on this topic tonight?
Not right now.
Okay, Steve. Tim.
Good.
Anything else? Gloria.
I think it's been covered.
Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate the presentation, good conversation, council and staff. And anything else you want to need from us tonight?
I don't. Yeah. So if you have stuff early, send it in Monday morning, the 26th. That's kind of my cutoff to deal with it. But I'll take it as soon as you have it because I'm sure there's a lot to catch.
Okay. Very good.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. You move on to disposition of communications. We have several emails, council. One was email from Abby Dubasar regarding placing tables and paved space in front of some businesses on Main Street. Staff is suggesting a refer for memo if you're interested. Otherwise, we can just decline to refer it.
I would move we refer it to staff for a memo.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second.
All right.
Sort of what our current plan is for that area and the feasibility of the concept.
I guess, did she mention that's in keeping with the downtown, Main Street groups wishes? I don't know if there's a subcommittee. She member of the committee. We'll check. That's what I want to check.
Yeah, it would seem appropriate too, just to have staff contact Ames Main Street too,
We will.
and get
See
their
what they
feedback
think,
too.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, and also look into the vending licenses that might currently be applicable to that area that she has referred to.
Those are all good things for a memo.
okay, you understand the motion? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstaining? Carried. Second is a letter from Steve Young regarding operating partner with Freddy's Frozen Custard and Steak Burgers, requesting for permanently utilizing reserved spaces, parking spaces at 2 meters on Lincoln Way for contactless orders.
Yeah, you don't have to refer this if you don't think it's a good policy to start designating public spaces for
On
individual
Lincoln Way.
business.
I thought we already discussed this in relation to another request.
Which one?
I can't remember who it was. I thought it was another, was it a?
We did, was it a
we did-
temporary, was it?
We did for the post office, didn't we?
No,
Was
but
it a
I
pizza
thought
place?
It was,
It was a year or so ago.
We did something for Freddy's.
Yeah.
was it just Freddy's
It
again?
was Freddy's last year. in November.
Temporarily.
Didn't we discuss it
Just
with like the
pandemic.
outdoor
Yeah.
cafes, kind of?
I think it's
It was-
challenging, once we go down this road, I think
Yeah.
there's going to be lots of these.
Yeah.
When they made a decision to acquire that space for a restaurant, it had certain attributes, and I just think it's really hard to reconfigure this now.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think the idea of having a designated space for contactless orders for all of the restaurants in that area is
Right.
interesting, but I don't know how you would do it per
Restaurant.
restaurant. I mean, just like you see in other urban places where they've got designated places for Lyft to pick people up or whatever, and spots for DoorDash drivers or Eat Street drivers or
Right.
whoever to stop and grab food. But I just don't know practically how it would
So,
work.
Is there a motion to
well,
decline?
but
the
I mean,
request?
is there, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that, like placing them sort of around certain areas.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
not these guys.
that's not what
specifically.
they're
So at the
asking,
moment,
but I think the idea of having two, I'm just making up a number, two designated spots for people who work for DoorDash, Eat Street, et cetera, to pick up food from areas where there are several restaurants in one spot is an interesting concept, because otherwise it's very inconvenient, right? Not only if you're the driver, but if you're on the receiving end, and it just lengthens the amount of time it's going to take to get your order and all those sorts of things.
So maybe, so I think we should respectfully decline, but maybe we should encourage them to reach out to Campus Action.
Yeah.
And encourage a proposal that's more macro oriented rather than,
specific to their
Yeah.
business.
so I think you have a really interesting idea, Amber. I just would rather see.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe this will start a conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't think it's practical to do it for each and every place, but I think the idea of having a designated spot is interesting.
And I think that may be sort of what they allude to towards the end of their letter, but they don't exactly ask for that. So
Right.
if they
Mhm. Yeah.
reformulate it like along the lines of what you're saying, please make a motion.
Yeah, I would move that we would respectfully decline to take this up, but we would encourage them to reach out to CAA to explore whether there is merit to a policy for Campus Town.
A general drop off area.
Mhm.
Second.
Okay. Those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried.
Good idea, Amber.
Email from Ken and Margie Howe regarding a potential land exchange, 811 South Duff for lot south of 230 Washington.
Is that actually south? I was trying to figure out how there could be any parking south of their.
That's what I was.
There is a piece of property. I
There's
looked on
city land.
Beacons. There's
Is
It's
it
full of grass
south?
right now.
The street?
No, there's grass. There's a
between the
large.
street and their property. There's
It's
actually
Washington
grass.
site, remember that? So the question is, do you want to swap that? They're not similar value properties.
We need to separate these things.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't see any way that we could. I'm not interested in pursuing this right up front.
Is that a motion? Decline?
I'm not sure if there's something that we can do in addition to declining.
Or do you want to refer for memo and then make a decision?
No, I mean, if they want to approach the city with an offer to buy some land, then they're free to do that at any time. So I would just move to decline this immediate offer.
Second.
But how does that allow the conversation to take place?
Because the city is buying the land near Iowa Creek, right? They can approach the city at any time saying, we would like to buy some land from you, the city. I don't see why it should be structured as a swap of
It's not
anything.
the, yeah.
Just two separate deals.
Yeah. They should be independently evaluated on their merits.
So can you, like the last one, can you suggest that in the letter?
Did they do this before? We turned them down?
I think Marjorie, Vanessa and I spent some time trying to go through our emails. It was in 2017, maybe
Yeah.
18, they had made a similar request to acquire that piece of property, and staff had visited with them and kind of outlined the limitations of its use, and they didn't follow through on a specific proposal. So yeah, 3 years ago, they did ask to buy it, but we never got back to you because they never got back to you on making an actual proposal at that time.
Or parking lot there?
So we can just say we're not interested in swapping land. The end.
Right. And if
Yeah.
you're interested in selling our land, then I guess that's the question, if you want to indicate that. Or
Well, and
I
they
just think,
said they
well,
don't have
it-
any immediate plans, so
Right.
they
I think
wouldn't
it
have
would
to.
just be the polite thing to do to remind them that they have that as an option to purchase that land.
But not that we've really
Okay.
considered whether
Right.
whether we're
Right.
interested.
Right. I don't think you've ever conversed
Yeah.
on what you would want to ever do with that land.
No, but yeah, they could ask again. It would,
That'll hold, yeah, that might send a message that you're willing to consider it, so I don't know if you are. But we'll have to pay fair market value for the
Of course.
land, you
yeah.
understand?
Okay. Everyone, those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried. And there was one that came from
Corey, you have to remind me, is Miss,
Thompson on this non-conforming garage, and it came in actually on the 13th. I think I failed to get it to Diane and to get it in here, but it certainly made the cutoff. Does everyone remember?
council will receive the
Yes.
copy in timely fashion, right?
Right, Tom.
You can refer that to us, that would be to Kelly to talk
I
about
know.
that.
Yeah, I would move that we refer it to Kelly so we could get a memo that explains the situation for these non-conforming structures.
Right.
I already talked to him about it, but everybody else didn't, so.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right. Everyone recall what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, David?
Yep.
I think,
This is worthy of discussion, I believe.
yeah, it's.
It's
we've
not the
had
only one.
the
Oh, I
discussion
know.
about commercial structures when we did the downtown
Yeah.
gateway,
Yeah.
but we haven't talked about all of these non-conforming garages in older neighborhoods. And it is a pretty big issue.
Yeah, people want garages if you want to maintain the houses, those affordable houses, we have to just,
So I'd
with
be
it.
interested.
Yeah.
Finding out what the dynamics are.
Okay.
And maybe also, is it possible to find out an estimate, Kelly, of whether this is a major thing or a minor issue to look into? I'm
What does that
guessing
mean?
it's pretty major.
In quantity of
Staff time.
Yeah.
I mean, the memo won't be
no.
too much to explain it. I think in my mind, I have two options for you. One of them is extensive and one of them won't be,
Okay.
but I
You
can
mean to fix it?
to adjust it. I don't say
Yeah.
fix it, to adjust it. You're implying there's something wrong with it.
Excuse me.
So yeah, it's not the only property in town. I mean, you can go in Old Town and find non-conforming garages everywhere. So it's yeah, it's probably worth a conversation. It hasn't been revisited for 20 years since we wrote the zoning ordinance.
Right.
Those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried. Thank you. All right. On to council comments. Gloria, anything tonight?
I don't think I have any. Well, I do, actually. I'm really glad that we're seeing the draft of the 2040 plan finally, and I'm looking forward to moving forward with this. That's it.
Nothing tonight?
Rachel?
I would just want to remind anyone that is planning on applying for the supplemental input committee for the climate action plan that those applications are due on July 23rd
And how would they apply if they wanted to apply?
on the city website.
Very good. Amber?
Nope, nothing tonight.
David?
Nothing tonight.
Bronwyn?
Nothing for me.
I'll just say that we had a wonderful ribbon cutting this afternoon out at Come and Go on by Dayton Road. Have two brand new fast electronic chargers and had a great turnout. Lots of electric vehicle owners and vehicles that were there, and it's just exciting to see making more infrastructure available for that coming need, and looking to get more in the future. So anyway, all right. With that, entertain motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
All right, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody.